Hey guys, we're back with another pretty big Survivor ranking here, and one that I've been pretty excited to do for a while now. But today I'll be doing my final Juror ranking for Survivor, where in this video I'll be ranking the person on each season of Survivor that was voted out right before Final Tribal. And in general, I find this to be a pretty interesting concept. It includes some pretty notable players, and with that, I do feel like there are some interesting placements to get into here. Now, before I get started, I did want to clarify who will be on this list. So for seasons that end in a final two, the final juror will be the third place finisher on the season. And on seasons that end with a final three, it'll be the fourth place finisher. And whether they were voted out or taken out in the fire making twist, it will just be the final person who was eliminated before Final Tribal. But with all that out of the way, we have 49 players to get into, and let's not waste any more time, let's get into the video. So starting off at number 49, the worst final juror in Survivor history to me is pretty obvious after going through all of them, but at number 49, we have Ozzy, and this is his game from Survivor South Pacific. And the major reason Ozzy's at the very bottom here is he was voted out and had to come back into the game in order to be a final juror. In fact, he was voted out twice before entering the final four, which is already a pretty massive issue. And while he's not the only final juror on this list who was voted out and had to come back into the game, I feel like Ozzy's game out of those people is the worst out of those three, where I feel like he's someone who not only spent the most amount of time outside of the game, where he was voted out and had to spend time on Redemption Island, but also didn't have much control even when he was within the proper game. Where early on, while he's a part of the majority of the original stuff, i.e., he's not really in control of that, where there are very few points where he's really getting his way, where right at the bat, he wants to keep Semhar around, but is unable to get the numbers to keep her around, has to vote her out there. And while he's part of the majority to take out Papa Bear in the next tribal, he's in blindside the following round, where he ends up losing Elise, who was pretty close to him at that point, and it was pretty clear that that move was made in order to weaken Ozzy specifically. And just in general, it feels like Ozzy is looked at as a source of challenge strength, where while he's being kept around due to said challenge strength, he's not really well positioned within the Savai group. And I feel like had they gotten the numbers after the merge, he probably would have been targeted down the road anyway, to where I feel like he wasn't really set up to win the game, had his tribe on the numbers, and also wasn't really calling the shots and wasn't really getting his way there. But then we get to the final round before the merge, where he is technically voted out there. However, I don't really fault this too much to his game, as this was done specifically so that Ozzy could go to Redemption Island, beat Christine in the duel, and come back into the game, ensuring that his tribe would be tied in numbers coming into the merge. And I feel like considering that Ozzy was fully committed to going along with this plan, and considering that they knew that the merge was around the corner and that this was a season with Redemption Island, I feel like this was probably the correct move for Ozzy's game as well as the Savai's. And while he probably would have been in a bad spot even if the Savai's had gotten the numbers, it probably would have been even worse if they had lost the numbers, and if they allowed Cochrane to be voted out instead and lose the duel there, I feel like it would have just doomed his side to be picked off. So I feel like it was better for him to at least have a shot of getting the numbers after the merge. And we see him succeed in that plan, where he's able to win the duel and come back into the game immediately afterwards. The problem is that they're not able to manage Cochrane, who was at the bottom of the Savai group, to where he ends up flipping over on the revote that following tribal, sending out Keith and ensuring that Savai is down in numbers. And then immediately afterwards, Ozzy is picked off himself, where he is sent back to Redemption Island, and from that point on spends the majority of the post-merge on Redemption Island, just winning duel after duel. But again, he's not really playing the game of Survivor, and he is obviously not really like factoring into things. And then he's eventually able to come back at the Final Five, where from that point on, he's the biggest target on the board. And while he's able to win Final Five immunity, he ends up losing Final Four immunity and is taken out there. So obviously, it's a very rocky game where he does spend a decent amount of it on Redemption Island, not really playing the game of Survivor. And even when he was in the game, he wasn't really in that great of a spot anyway, and wasn't really like succeeding very often. So again, on the whole, it is a very rough game. I will say the one redeeming quality to Ozzy's game is that he was a pretty big jury threat by the end of the season, to where had he won that final immunity challenge and got to the end, he would have won against everyone there, which I do have to give him at least some credit for. But again, I feel like that alone is not enough to have him too much higher here, where considering that he was voted out 3 times over the course of the season, mixing the fact that his game outside of that wasn't very impressive anyway, it's very hard for me to not have him at the very bottom here at number 49. Now moving on to number 48, and we have yet another person who was voted out and had to come back into the game, and we actually have someone who will be on Survivor 50, but at number 48 we do have Rick Devens from Edge of Extinction. And Rick Devens is another person who was voted out, had to come back into the game through the Edge of Extinction twist. And I feel like even when he was in the game, there's a lot of rockiness within that. Where early on, he's in a fine enough position initially where he's pretty safe, working alongside David Wright and Chris, and they're able to vote out Reem and Keith without too much difficulty. But then we get to the falling around, where he is initially on board to target Wentworth in that spot. However, he does eventually capitulate and agree to vote out Chris, which by itself is not a great move, as Chris was one of his numbers, and by doing so, he's essentially handing all the power on the Manu side over to the Wentworth, Lauren, and Wardog side of things. However, I can at least understand his reasoning for doing so, as they were expecting a swap to happen not too long afterwards, and recognizing that they would probably be down in numbers in most configurations, that it was better for them to try to stick together to try to make a bigger move happen on whatever swap trade they ended up on. So again, I can at least understand that reasoning to it. Unfortunately, the swap doesn't really work out that way, where instead they all end up being swapped back together, minus Wendy. That really puts Devens in a pretty bad spot, and he's immediately voted out afterwards, sending him to the edge of extinction. And obviously that's pretty bad. He is the 4th boot of the season, and does eventually come back at the merge, which is obviously a pretty massive hole to his game. The fact that he was voted out, had to come back into the game. But then even after coming back from the edge, he's still not in that great of a spot for a lot of it, where we do see him being on the outs immediately afterwards, where he doesn't really know what's going on when Joe gets voted out. He's also on the outs during the Eric round, where despite him trying to work with the commas, he's not really looped into that plan. And while he is part of the Juliet plan, he's then once again on the outs at the final 10, where he and David are being targeted, and is eventually on the outs when David gets taken out. And while he's pulled into the Wentworth blindside at the final 9, he's once again on the outs at the Wardog blindside at the final 8. He's also out of the loop at the final 7, where he's a pretty massive target on the board with Ron trying to target him. But despite him picking up on the fact that Ron was targeting him, he's not even looped into the counter strike to take out Ron, where instead the likes of Gavin and Lauren pull that plan together. And he remains a pretty big target from that point on in the game, where at the first final 6 round, he would have been voted out had he not won immunity there. He needs an idol for the second final 6 round, where Victoria goes out. He wins immunity at final 5 to where he would have been voted out there had he not won it. In that final 4, he ends up being taken on fire after Chris puts himself into fire to take him on, recognizing that Devens was a pretty big jury threat. So again, it is a pretty rough game where there are plenty of points, even when he's in the game, where he's just out of the loop, not in a great position, and not really getting his way at certain points, and also needing idols and immunities to get through a lot of the game. So it's obviously pretty bad by itself, but it's also the fact that he was the 4th boot of the season that makes it very hard for me to have him too high in this ranking, where the one redeeming quality is that similar to Ozzy, he was a pretty big jury threat. He would have won had he gotten to the end, so at least there's that, but I feel like there are enough holes with this game to where he is here at number 48. Now moving on to number 47, and we have yet another person who was voted out and had to come back into the game. By number 47, we do have Tina Wesson, and this being her game from Survivor Blood vs. Water. And I feel like of these people who were voted out and had to come back in, I feel like Tina's was the most impressive to me, where for one, she lasted the longest before being voted out, where she wasn't voted out the first time until the final 9. And I also have fewer issues with her game outside of being voted out as well, where she was actually part of the majority for a decent amount of her run up until that final 9 round, where early on she's in a pretty good spot in the original Galong, where her and R seem to be running things on that original tribe, where they're definitely the decision makers at the one tribal they go to take out Laura Moret. After the merge, she's able to reunite with Katie and is also able to pick up Vitas to build an alliance there, and they're able to hold the numbers at the 2 tribals they go to, voting out Kat and Laura Bonham. But then after the merge is where things do fall apart for them, where at that point Tyson is able to really outplay the Aris and Tina sides by pulling in the singles, and through that they're able to blindside Aris at that round, really dismantling Tina's game. And she's really on the outs for that rest of the run, where while she's able to survive the Vitas round at the final 10, she's taken out herself at the final 9. And from that point on, she does spend the next few rounds on Redemption Island, where she's able to eventually get back into the game at the final 5, where at that point, she's a pretty clear target on the board. And while she's able to survive over Sierra at the final 5 round, she's eventually taken out herself at final 4. So really, it's not the greatest game in the world, where again, she does lose control after the merge and is voted out, which is a major reason why she is this low on the list. Though with that said, I still think she definitely has win equity on the season. Now, granted, not to the same extent as Ozzy or Devens, where I feel like either of them would have won handily against anyone. I don't know if Tina beats Tyson necessarily, where while she definitely would have had votes in that scenario, I feel like Tyson would have put up a very solid fight against her. So I do feel like her win equity is probably a bit lower than Ozzy or Devens. However, I feel like her navigation through the game was a bit more impressive, where obviously she was in the majority for way more of the game than Ozzy or Devins ever were, and also the fact that she at least lasted the longest before being voted out. That is obviously the reason why she is the highest out of these people who were voted out and had to come back in. But at the end of the day, it's that flaw that leaves her this low here at number 47. Now moving on to number 46, and from this point on, every single person made it to at least the final 4 round without ever being voted out here. Though at number 46, we have someone who, I've already talked about this person's game in a previous video. However, I think it's a very flawed one considering their placement on the season. But at number 46, I do have Terry Dietz, and this being his game from Survivor Panama. And I do feel like Terry is someone who, despite him technically getting all the way to the final 3 without ever being voted out, he's also someone who essentially won out from the merge on to even get to the final 3 to begin with. And obviously that's a pretty massive hole within his game. Now, I will say that his game early on is actually pretty good, where he does seem to be in a pretty solid spot in the original Laminas, where he's not really in danger during either the Misty, Ruth Marine, or Dan rounds, where he's pretty safe there. Now, I will say that him voting out Dan is not particularly great, where even though he remains pretty safe in that round, I do feel like he really hands a lot of control of the Lamina group to the Austin and Nick side of things, to where had the Laminas held the numbers after the merge, it probably would have made Terry a pretty big target down the road anyway, and also not really having that many numbers to really save himself to counter Nick and Austin. But regardless, they were coming to the merge down numbers anyway, so whatever. But then we get to the merge, where Lamina is down in numbers, and from that point on, they are obviously being picked off. And Terry is really the biggest target out of all of them, where he would have been voted out at any single one of those tribals had he not won immunity. But instead, he ends up winning the next 5 immunities in a row, getting him all the way to the final 4 just through winning immunities. Not to mention, Bruce being medevac at the final 7, that means he has to win 1 fewer immunity to get to that point. But I think the biggest aspect to all this is the fact that he has the Super Idol that allows him to play the votes after the votes are read, and the fact that he's able to play at the final 4, which is deeper in the game than what a current idol can be played at, which essentially gave him implicit immunity at the final 4 round, which ended up being one of the only times he does not win immunity there. So I do feel like Terry really just wins out from the merge on, despite him being such a massive target from so early on in the game. And even aside from him winning immunities, he's still not really getting his way at many points, where he never votes correctly during the post-merge, where during the Nick, Austin, and Sally rounds, he does not vote them out there. That's pretty bad. At the final 6, he's also on the outs when Courtney gets taken out and is really outplayed by Suri, Aris, and Danielle there. At the final 5, he also votes incorrectly, where he votes for Aris despite Shane going out. And then at the final 4, while he technically votes out Suri there, it was also a tie, and it was clearly a situation where he was trying to pick up Danielle to ensure that she would take him to the end over Aris. But even then, it doesn't amount to much, where despite Danielle winning final immunity, she takes Aris to the end over him. So even taking out the fact that he wins immunities, he's still not really in the majority. He's still not getting his way at many points, and he's unable to really change his position for the better. So I do feel like all those things are pretty massive issues with Terry's game. But again, similar to Ozzy, similar to Devins, he would have won had he gotten to the end, where had he won that final immunity, he would have been going up against a majority Lamina jury, to where he would have gotten pretty much all those votes, mixing in Bruce and Shane. I do feel like Terry wins if he gets to the end. But again, I feel like it would have been a spot to where he would have won out from the merge on and was pretty much on the bottom the entire time. So I feel like it's one of those reasons that despite his win equity, I can't have him any higher than number 46. Now moving on to number 45, and we're now moving on to people who really spent a lot of their seasons on the bottom and didn't play well within that. But number 45, we probably have the person who played the most actively bad out of this grouping here, and that person is Keith Nail, and this is his game from San Juan del Sur. And Keith's game here is really rocky, where he just spends pretty much the entire season on the bottom, barely surviving, and also has some pretty questionable moves within that. Now, to be fair, he's actually in an okay spot on his original tribe, where he's not really being targeted at first, and even has a good enough relationship with Jeremy. But then he burns his relationship with Jeremy by telling the tribe that Jeremy has an idol, even though that isn't true. And he really just makes himself a pretty big target in that spot. And we see that playing out at the one tribal they go to, where even though the target lands on Drew Christie by the end of it, you still have the likes of Jeremy talking about targeting Keith in that spot. And Keith himself isn't even included on the plan, where he ends up voting for Julie in that spot, so he's on the outs there. After that, he gets a pretty interesting swap where he's the only single on a tribe full of couples, where you have the Wentworths on one side, John Jacqueline on another side, and Baylor and Missy on another side. And he does side with John Jacqueline to take out the Wentworths back to back at those next two tribals. Though with that said, Baylor and Missy do flip against him to where they do decide to target him during the Dale tribal, but he's able to scrape through that. But then we get to the merge, where from that point on, he is pretty much on the bottom moving forward, and also never votes correctly at any of those tribals, which is pretty unfortunate there, where during the Josh tribal, he's working with Josh, but is outnumbered there. But he's also on the outs during the Jeremy tribal, where the majority flips on Jeremy, but he's out of the loop there. He votes for Reed. At the following round, he is pulled into this plan from Reed to try to blindside John with an idol in his pocket, which did seem likely to go through, but then Keith ends up leaking it at tribal by telling Reed to stick to the plan that tips off the other side to get John to play his idol, and also split their votes on Keith and Wes to where Keith has to play an idol to save himself, but in the process also loses his own son, which is pretty bad. And while he is in the majority to take out Reed the following round, he becomes a pretty big target from the final 7 on, where at the final 7, he's a pretty big target from the John Jacqueline side, and is largely saved by Natalie flipping to weaken John, takes out Alec in the process, a plan that Keith didn't really know about, but whatever. At the final 6, he's a pretty big target again, but is saved by this plan to blindside John at that point and is saved there. Final 5, he wins immunity and probably would have been voted out had he not won said immunity, but he does. And then the final 4, he loses immunity, gets taken out there. So on the whole, it is a pretty rough game where there are almost no points in the game where he's truly in that great of a spot. There are plenty of points where he plays actively bad, like him blowing up his relationship with Jeremy early on, also him blowing up the John blindside at the final 9 that results in him losing his own son. I think there's a lot bad there with Keith's game, and it's really hard for me to have him too high in this ranking. Though with that said, he did seem to have a good amount of win equity to where I feel pretty confident that he wins against Baylor and Missy. Even against Jacqueline, I think he has a very good shot at winning that. And I think he also could get some votes against Natalie. So I do think by the end, Keith did have some win equity on the board to where I think that's at least a minor consideration for him being higher. But I think it's the fact that he's on the bottom for pretty much his entire run, and also him playing pretty actively poorly at points that results in him being here at number 45. Now moving on to number 44, and we have yet another player who was largely on the bottom during a lot of their run, and also someone who very rarely voted correctly on their season. But at number 44, we do have Eddie from Survivor Caramoan, and Eddie's another one who was on the bottom for pretty much his entire run, where there was never truly a point where he was truly in the driver's seat outside of one round, and even that's pretty questionable. But right away in the original fans tribe, he is pretty clear on the bottom, where while he's part of the Cool Kids Alliance, they're quickly put in their place where they end up on the outs during both the Allie and Hope rounds, where during the Hope round in particular, he was his secondary target, but they end up going for Hope instead on the revote. That's pretty bad. After the swap, he is down in numbers, and I'm not too sure where he would have stood had they gone the tribal, although he's able to build a good enough bond with Malcolm that pays dividends after the merge. But then after the merge, he is once again put on the bottom, where while the fans are able to pull in the likes of Malcolm and Corinne, they're clearly outnumbered there, and ended up losing Corinne at that first tribal. He loses out again the following round, where Michael Snow goes out and he votes for Andrea there. But then we get to the Three Amigos tribal, which is the one point in the season where Eddie can kind of be in the majority, where at that point he's working with Malcolm and Reynolds, and through them having two idols, they're essentially able to force their way at that one tribal. Though even then, Eddie was a secondary target, and we even see that Eddie thought he was the one going out until Malcolm pulled up the second idol there, which is obviously not great. And on top of that, they decided to target Philip in that spot, which I don't think is the greatest target for them, where I feel like Philip was not that central of a figure within the majority alliance and was more so the figurehead there. And I feel like they would have had a better shot at cracking the majority had they gone for a juicier target in the likes of Cochran or Dawn, or even Andrea would have been a better target there. But I feel like by going for Philip, it doesn't really do that much damage to the majority. And we see that the following round, where at that point the majority is able to quickly regroup, and they're able to pick off Malcolm and Reynolds back to back, leaving Eddie all alone in the game. And he's mostly kept around due to there being bigger threats in the game, where at the final 7, Andrea gets blindsided with an idol in her pocket. Though even then, Eddie himself was on the outs for this plan, where he ends up voting for Brenda here, working with Andrea. and he was also the secondary target to where he would have been taken out had Andrea played her idol there. That's pretty bad. Final 6 is a very similar story, where he is also out of the loop, where he votes for Eric despite Brenda being the boot, and also despite him being the secondary target, again, where Brenda and Eric do vote for him there. That's also pretty bad. And then the final 4, he's just voted out after failing win final immunity. So on the whole, I feel like it's a pretty rough game where he ends up having a pretty disastrous track record where out of all the tribals he attends, he only votes correctly 3 times, where he votes correctly at the Laura round, which was a unanimous vote. He votes correctly at the Philo Tribal, which was due to idol plays that allowed his side to get their way there. And he technically votes for Malcolm at the Malcolm Tribal, albeit on the revote, in a position to where he voted for Andrea on the initial round, but whatever. So he's really on the outs for so much of the season, and even at points where he should be looped into plans, he's simply not, and he's very much just an afterthought to people in the game. And beyond that, he was targeted quite a bit throughout the game. He was very rarely in the majority. And he's also someone who I don't think wins at the end, where I feel like even if he had gotten to the end, he would not have won a jury vote against most people. So I feel like on the whole, I feel like Eddie's game is pretty bad, where I feel like he's on the bottom for pretty much his entire run. He is very rarely in control of things. And even when he's not being targeted, he's still not voting correctly at most opportunities. So it's for that reason that I can't really have many higher than number 44. Now moving on to number 43, and we have yet another person who I feel like played pretty poorly despite them getting all the way to the final 4. But at number 43, we do have Angela from Survivor Ghost Island. And I've already talked about Angela in my Ghost Island videos, but I do feel like her game is also pretty bad here for a final juror, where despite her technically being in the majority and despite her voting correctly more often than someone like Eddie, I feel like she still played pretty passively and is someone who very rarely took the reins of the game despite her being on the bottom of the majority for pretty much her entire run. Where early on in the original Navidi, she was just kind of there, where even though they never go to tribal and even though it didn't seem like she would have been voted out there, she wasn't really doing that much on that group and it's just kind of whatever. But then we get to the swap, which ends up being a pretty disastrous round for her, where well, she does get pretty unlucky by Chris Noble being sent to Ghost Island and being safe through that. We see her trying to keep the Navidis together to hold the numbers there, but completely fails at that. And it even gets to the point where the other Navidis flip on her, where Wendell, Dominic, and Morgan were going to vote her out there, which is pretty insane that the very people she was trying to work with were also trying to vote her out in this tribal, and she's completely unaware of all of this. And she ultimately gets saved by the Malolos on their tribe, taking advantage of the division there to pull off a Morgan blindside, where they end up taking on Morgan instead. Again, another plan that Angela was completely unaware of, and she ends up getting blindsided this tribal, which is pretty bad there. But then afterwards, she doesn't even work with the Malolos moving forward, where despite her knowing that her own Navidis tried to vote her out, she doesn't even try to flip against them, where instead she just is resigned to working with them and wants to remain Navidi strong, which is pretty questionable there. And that carries over for pretty much the rest of the game, where we get to the second swap, where even though she was seen as a swing vote for the James tribal, she ends up sticking Navidi strong there, votes out James. We then get to the merge, where she's on the losing side of the Dom and Chris battle, where she is trying to work with Chris and tries flipping the vote onto Libby, but is unsuccessful there. After that, she spends the next few rounds just being blindly loyal to the Dom and Wendell side, not really doing anything to change her situation, despite her being on the bottom of that power structure. And while she does work with Chelsea to try to flip the game on Wendell at the final 8, she's unable to pull in Laurel and Donathan there. And outside that one attempt, she doesn't even try to flip beyond that, where you had Michael pushing her to flip during the Desiree round, but she's unreceptive there. You have Sebastian approaching her to flip on Dom at the final 6, only for her to leak the plan to Dom, which is pretty bad. And she eventually gets to a final 4 where no one's taking her to the end, and she ends up being taken out in fire at that point. And this is all despite her having no win equity, where by that point she was kind of seen as a really passive player, someone who was not going to win at the end, really against anyone. So I do feel like despite that, Angela not even being taken to the end and just losing in fire is all pretty underwhelming there. And on the whole, I feel like Angela's game is also pretty lackluster, where while she's technically in the majority for a decent amount of the game and is voting correctly, more so than the likes of Keith or Eddie, she's very clearly on the bottom of that group and is more so just sticking by original tribal lines because that's just the type of person that Angela is. And even beyond that, there are still points where she's not getting her way, where she clearly loses the battle between Chris and Dom, where she was clearly closer to Chris than the Dom, but despite that, still decides to work with Dom after Chris goes out. You have her almost being voted out by her fellow Navides, despite her wanting to work with them, and not even taking measures against them after they made it clear that they were going to vote her out there. And the fact that she's just not taken to the end, despite her having zero win equity, all those things are pretty bad to me, and it's for that reason that she's here at number 43. Now moving on to number 42, and we have yet another person who really spent their entire game on the bottom of the majority alliance, and despite that was not even taken to the end by the group that she was working with. But at number 42, we do have Christina from Survivor One World, and Christina is another person who is technically voting correctly in most tribals she attends, and is someone who is technically working with the majority alliance, but despite that is clearly on the bottom of the majority alliance and doesn't really do much to counteract the big power player in the game, that being Kim, and is just content to be taken out in 4th place by the end of it, which is all pretty bad there. Where early on, she's not really that well situated on the women's tribe, where even though there's an easy target in Nina, she does still get a vote from Monica at that tribal, and is also seen as pretty abrasive, though is able to scrape through that. After the swap, she ends up getting blindsided at the Monica tribal, where she's the only person to stick by Monica, and probably gets voted out had Colton not been medevac, where it did seem like she would have been on the bottom of that tribe, but through Colton getting medevac, that round gets canceled. That's pretty bad. And then after the merge, she ends up being saved by the fact that Kim decides to side with the original women's side of things, where she very easily could have sided with her swap tribe, but through her sticking with the original tribe, that does leave Christina in the majority, where she's able to work with the other women to pick off the remaining men in the game. Now, to her credit, there did seem to be a point where she could have ended up in a final 3 with Alicia and Tarzan, where supposedly those 3 were pretty close. Though by the end, Christina doesn't really stick true to that, where she ends up voting out Tarzan at the final 6. And that leaves her in a pretty rough spot at the final 5, where she ends up on the outs when Alicia gets taken out. And then at the final 4, she's clearly the last woman standing on the outs and is pretty easily picked off when Kim wins immunity. Though even then, Christina doesn't really put up a fight there, where they're even admitting openly at tribal that Christina's about to get voted out and Christina's not really fighting back. So again, that's another knock to her game. So I feel like Christina's someone who is working with the majority for a lot of the game, but isn't really well positioned within that. She's clearly on the bottom. And I think she also sacrifices her own position within that group to stick by Kim, despite Kim having no intention to go to the end with her. And also despite her having no win equity either, where even if she had gotten to the final 3, she loses there. Even if she gets to the end with Sabrina and Chelsea, she also loses. And I even think if she had gotten to the end with Alicia and Tarzan, she probably loses to Alicia. So I feel like by the end, Christina really had no win equity on the season. Though despite that, really enabled a power structure that did not benefit her, despite her thinking that it benefited her at a point. And just by the end, I find her game pretty lackluster as well, which is why she's here at number 42. Now moving on to number 41, and we have yet another person who was blindly working with the majority for the entire game and wasn't really a driving force behind that. Though despite that, I feel like they have fewer holes with their game compared to Christina or Angela. But at number 41, we do have Jan from Survivor Thailand. And Jan's another person who was pretty content working with the majority, doesn't really have any intentions to flip on that group, doesn't really have any designs in trying to drive the votes in that group, is also not caring too much about being well positioned to win in that group either. It's just pretty loyal to that group for the entire season, where she ends up voting correctly at every single tribal except for the Ganya tribal, where she does vote for Clay there, though even then I'm willing to excuse that to a degree. But really outside of that, she just sticks by Brian and Clay for pretty much the entire season, where her tribe comes into the merge with the numbers, they pick off the remaining tribe. Once it's down to the original Chewy guns, Brian and Clay keep her around due to her being the smallest threat between Helen and Ted, and also the least likely to win final immunity. She gets to the final 3, doesn't win final immunity, gets voted out. So I feel like there isn't too much to say about Jan's game here. The reason I have her above the people we just talked about, though, is I feel like there are less wonky situations with how Jan got through the game, where again, with Christina, she ends up being saved by Colton being medevac right before the merge. With Angela, you have her almost being voted out in the 3rd round of the season. I feel like Jan is someone who wasn't really in that much danger going out before she ends up being taken out at the final 3. And on top of that, I feel like she also has a bit more win equity than those two, where I feel like you can argue that she wins against Clay as she got to the end. I think even against Brian. I know there are people who believe that she wins against Brian. I don't know if I believe that, but I feel like Jan probably had more of a shot of winning the season than either Christina or Angela here. But again, it's the fact that she was just so passive in the game and didn't really do much to change her fate in the game that leaves her here, number 41. Now moving on to number 40, and we have yet another person who spends pretty much the entire game on the bottom of the majority group, though despite that, still had some impressive elements to their game. But at number 40, we do have Denise from Survivor China, and Denise is yet another person who was on the bottom of her majority group for the entire season. And I feel like she doesn't make much progress in getting out of the bottom, where it very much feels like Todd, Courtney, and Amanda are the core of the Fei Long alliance that drives a lot of the action in the game, and Denise is just kind of there. Though with that said, she is still working with that group for pretty much the entire season, where outside the John Robert round, she votes correctly at every single tribal she attends, and is also never targeted up until her boot round, which, again, I do have to give her at least some credit for that. She is at least pretty safe in the game. And I also think she was at least willing to flip on top by the end of it, where, while I do think she waited too long, where I feel like there were opportunities for her to do so beforehand, like at the final 7 or the final 6, and she simply refused to do it at that point. She at least was trying to get Amanda to flip on him by the final 4 round, which I had to give her at least some credit for, but it was obviously unsuccessful in getting any other votes there. But it's the fact that she was at least willing to flip on top by the end of it was enough to have her above these other people, though at the same time, I think win equity is also an issue for Denise, where I don't really know if she can win a jury vote by the end of it, or while I think she could get some votes in a lot of scenarios, I don't know if it'll be enough for her to truly win against the likes of Todd or Amanda. So really, I feel like that's also pretty hard when assessing her game, but it's the fact that she was at least willing to flip at a point, and also the fact that she was pretty safe during her run was enough to have her above these other people, to where she's here at number 40. Now moving on to number 39, and I had no idea what to do with this person. I really went back and forth over this person's exact placement. However, at number 39, I did decide to go with Brett from Survivor Samoa. And Brett is kind of a weird case here, as on one hand, he is someone who essentially had to win out to get to the final 4 position, where he won 3 immunities in a row coming into that final 4 round, all of which he needed, which is obviously not great, mixing in the fact that he was on the outs for a decent amount of the post-merge as well, where considering that his tribe came into the merge with an 8-4 numerical advantage, the fact that they end up squandering that lead is pretty embarrassing as well, and obviously those things are pretty bad for Brett's game here. And I think there is a serious argument for him being lower, as I feel like his game, in a lot of ways, is not that different from Terry Dietz. However, the reason I have him at least as high is, one, I feel like he was very well positioned on the original Galoos, where it very much felt like he was in the core alliance, and had the Galoos been able to hold the numbers after the merge and pick out the remaining Foas, I feel like Brett would have been in a very solid position to get towards the end there, where at the one trial they go to, they vote Yasmin, but even beyond that, I feel like he was pretty well positioned there. Also, after the merge, while they do lose the lead that they had, I don't really know how much to fault Brett in particular for a lot of those rounds, where I think the Kelly round in particular was very unlucky for the Galoo side of things, where the fact that Russell found another idol immediately after playing one, all without a clue, and was able to play successfully at that following tribal is honestly not something they could have really foreseen at that point in the show's history. And the fact that they lose Kelly that early on is not great. And yeah, we can point out the final 10 round where they're unable to keep Shambo and John from flipping in that situation. I don't really fault Brett too much for how the Galoos lost numbers there. But I think the other thing that keeps Brett at least as high for me is that while he did have to win out by the end of it, he was pretty safe before the final 7 round, where despite him being this pretty integral number for the Galoo side, the fact that he wasn't really being targeted before the final 7, where instead the foes were going for Kelly, Laura, even Dave over Brett, is at least somewhat impressive on Brett's end. And to me, that's a step above someone like Terry, who was targeted immediately after the merge when his side was down in numbers. The fact that Brett was able to remain somewhat safe while his fellow Galoos were being picked off is something to note here. And on top of that, Brett was also a pretty big jury threat, where by the time he was being targeted, he would have won against pretty much everyone left on the board had he gotten to the end. So again, I feel like there are definitely some pros to Brett's game, and those things are enough to keep him at least as high, despite the fact that he did technically have to win out by the end of it. But still, the fact that he was outside the core of things by the merge, and the fact that he did still have to win out, was enough to keep him here, number 39. Now moving on to number 38, and we are finally talking about our first new era player on this list, but still someone who I think was on the bottom for a decent amount of their run. But number 38, we do have Teeny from Survivor 47. And I've already talked about Teeny's game in my 47 coverage. However, I still think their game is pretty rocky, where I think they're actually on the bottom for way more of the game compared to some of the players we already talked about. And I do think that obviously makes it hard for me to have them too high. Though with that said, I think they're probably a better player than those people and was at least someone who's trying to make moves in the game, but was just very ineffective in doing so. Or I think we see that right away on the original Lava, where while they're not in the worst position in the world on that tribe, I feel like Genevieve is clearly more the driver's seat during that section of the game, and they end up losing Asia at the first tribal they go to, who was a clear number for Teeny, so I don't really love that aspect to it. Afterwards, they go on a journey right before going to the tribal where they agree to sacrifice their vote for the tribal in exchange for getting an amulet, which I'm not a huge fan of, as while this could build a bond for them later in the game, it also makes it more difficult for them to survive considering that they are about to go to tribal in a position to where they were on the outs just a previous round. And sure enough, they do end up losing Keisha at the next tribal, who was another number for them, which really leaves Teeny in a bad spot had they ever gone back to tribal, where even though I think Saul probably would have been the next to go, it's not possible to imagine Rome flipping the vote onto Teeny instead, but that's never fully tested. But then we get to the merge, where they are in the majority initially, where they do have the amulet plate on them that keeps them safe there. They get out Rome, which is pretty good for Teeny. But then we get to the final 10, where even though they are in the majority for that round, where the majority agrees to split their votes onto Sam and Sierra, it's in a spot to where Teeny clearly wanted to get Sam out in that spot, but is unable to get their way there, and the votes fall onto Sierra on the revote, which is pretty bad for Teeny in particular, as Sierra was one of their closest allies at that point. You have them trying once again to target Sam the following round, but is unable to get their way once again to where Saul goes out instead. Though to be fair, they are able to align with the Olgatas afterwards and are able to work with them for the next few rounds, where they do pick off Gabe at the final 9 and Kyle at the final 8. But then from the final 7 on, I think their game really goes downhill once again, where they are completely blindsided the final 7, where Operation Italy happens. They're not included on that. At the final 6, they try flipping to the Operation Italy side to try and target Rachel, only to be blindsided again when Rachel has an idol played on her, where Annie goes out instead. And while they are part of this plan to split the vote on Genevieve and Sam at the final 5, and they get to the final 4, where they get taken out in fire. So on the whole, it is a very mixed bag of a game, where while there are certainly points where Teeny is voting the majority, and while Teeny is probably more of an active player than a lot of the people we already talked about, I feel like they were also very ineffective at getting what they wanted, where I feel like there were so many points where they wanted to take out Sam, but was just unable to get their way at so many opportunities. And even in the pre-merge, they were on the outs for a decent amount of that game as well. Not to mention that they weren't the biggest trigger threat either, to where even if they had won the fire-making challenge, they probably lose to Rachel as well. So by the end, I feel like there isn't that much to praise with Teeny's game. But with that said, I feel like the fact that they were a more active player than the people we already talked about, and there were at least some points in the post-merge where they were in the majority, it was enough to have them at least as high, number 38. Now moving on to number 38, and we have another player who I would say is pretty active in the game, though I definitely question a lot of their decisions across the season. But at number 38, we do have Cass, and this is their game from Survivor Cagayan. And I think Cass played a very active game, albeit one where she wasn't really in the driver's seat for as much as I would like, and also someone who kind of blows up their game as well, that makes it so they can't really win by the end of it. Or while she does have a rocky start where she's on the outs at the David Samson round, she is able to really rebuild afterwards and is a key swing vote to take out Garrett the following round. Afterwards, she's also part of the majority to take out Jatia there. And she also gets a pretty good swap as well, where she is a pretty key swing vote at the one tribal they go to take out Alexis. So I do feel like her pre-merge game is pretty good for the most part, despite her being on the outs for that David Sampson round. But then we get to the merge, where her tribe does have the numbers initially, where the Aparis have a advantage over the Solanas, and they're also able to pull in Sarah, who was the swing vote at that point. And it did seem at first that they were going to get their way and taking out Jeffra, especially after Tony and LJ misplay their idols there. But then Cass decides to flip to take out Sarah instead, which I feel like is a pretty bad move for Cass, as even though I think Sarah played the round poorly by going on this power trip and really getting on Cass's nerves, I feel like Cass flipping here really dooms her game, as it does make her this pariah from the other side, where we even hear Spencer saying Cass 0% chance of winning after this tribal. And on top of that, while Cass does decide to work with the Tony side moving forward, she's not really in the driver's seat for the game moving forward, where despite her making this massive flip in the game, it's in a spot to where she really sinks all her social capital, and I feel like she's just kind of dragged moving forward, where while she does vet out Morgan the following round, she's then left out of the LJ blindside where Tony Wu decided to flip at that point. That's not great. At the final 8, she does vote out Jeremiah, but then at the final 7, she's once again let out of this flip, where Tony and Wu flip again to take out Jeffra, and while she's in the majority afterwards, taking out Tasha, Trish, and Spencer back to back, she doesn't really have much to do with those moves, where I feel like Tony is more so driving the action during that section of the game, and I feel like Cass really overestimates her agency at that point. And then we get to the final 3, where she gets voted out, despite her clearly being the biggest goat on the board, where despite Wu winning final immunity, and him even saying that he'd be the biggest idiot ever for taking Tony to the end, you have Tony manipulating Wu into voting out Cass over him. And I do at the fault Cass as well for not convincing Wu to take her to the end when it was clearly in his best interest to do so. So by the end, the fact that she's not even taken to the end despite her being this clear GOAT is a massive knock to her game as well. And just in general, I feel like Cass's game is a bit of a mess, where while she is active in the game and while she is technically in the majority for a lot of rounds in the post-merge, I feel like Tony really outplays her by the end of it. And I also think she makes some pretty bad moves, like the Sarah move at the merge, and also the fact that she's unable to convince Wu to take her to the end. I feel like those things are such big knocks to me that I can't have her any higher than number 37. Now moving on to number 36, and we have yet another player who I feel like played a pretty messy game, where even though they were somewhat active, I feel like there was also plenty of holes in their game. By number 36, we do have Ty, and this is his game from Survivor Game Changers. And Ty's game is kind of all over the place here, where while there are points where he's in the majority, he is also out of the loop for a decent amount of the game as well. Now, early on, I feel like his early game is pretty good, where it does seem like he's in a pretty good spot in his original tribe, and he's also relatively safe on his swap tribe. Though with that said, he does not get his way at the first tribal he goes to, where he's fighting to keep Caleb around, but kind of has his hand forced by the Brad side of things, is forced to vote out Caleb there, which is not great for Ty, as Caleb was obviously a number for him. We then get to the joint tribal, where he plays a pretty central role at that tribal, where Brad is able to convince him to place Idol and Sierra. That does allow his side to win out that battle, where they are able to save Sierra and taking out Malcolm in the process. That's pretty good. And after that, he does get a decent second swap, where he is in the majority during both the Sandra and Jeff Varner rounds. Though with that said, he does kind of play the Sandra round pretty sloppily, where he ends up telling Varner about the plan to target Sandra that makes him the secondary target of the tribal, not to mention the fact that he was trying to target Ozzy there, but doesn't get his way. So again, kind of a mixed bag, but for the most part, he's in the majority during the pre-merge, and even during the early merge, he is in the majority to take out both Haley Ford and Ozzy. But from that point on, his game gets pretty sloppy, where first up at the final 11, he is blindsided at the Debbie round, where the alliance that come together to target Ozzy fractures, and he's kind of left on the outs when Debbie gets taken out there. That's not particularly great. During the final 10, he's completely out of the loop when Zeke gets taken out, and with him also being targeted by Brad, Troyzan, and Sierra, he was in a very precarious spot during that tribal and didn't seem to realize it. And while he's able to recover a bit for the next few rounds, taking out Sierra and Andrea, when he gets to the final 7, where he ends up getting his vote stolen and was also secondary target of the tribal, which is not particularly great there, but he's able to scrape through that. At the final 6, he does team up with Sari and Aubrey to try and target Sarah at that point, and also plays 2 idols at the tribal, one for himself and one for Aubrey. Though unfortunately the plan backfires when Sarah plays her legacy advantage, while Troyzan also plays an idol that results in Sari being sniped out of the game by default in that spot, which is pretty dumb. And while it's unfortunate that Ty was unable to get his way due to there being all these advantages in play at that tribal, I think you can argue that he probably should have kept one of his idols around for the final 5 round and sort of let Aubrey be taken out there, as it would have at least given him another shot to take out one of Sarah, Brad, or Troyzan at that point. But instead he's on the outs from that point on, where at the final 5, he's forced to vote out Aubrey, and then at final 4, he's taken out himself. So not a great end game for him. And I feel like in general, Ty's game is pretty hard to assess, where while I think there are points where he is playing actively and there were opportunities for him to make moves in the game, I also don't think he was really in the driver's seat at many points, where even when he was in the majority, I don't really feel like he was the one dictating a lot of votes. And I think there are many points where he's outright not getting his way, like during the Caleb tribal and even the Sandra tribal. So I feel like those things make it pretty hard for me to assess Ty too highly. Though with that said, I feel like there are still enough points where he's at least playing actively enough to where I did decide to have him here at number 36. Now moving on to number 35, and we're actually talking about yet another new era player here, but at number 35, I did decide to go with Katurah from Survivor 45. And Katurah's game is also pretty hard to assess, as she's another player who, despite her playing actively and despite her having this clear-cut strategy of how to maneuver through the game, it was also a strategy that didn't lend to her having much control, and I think even by the end it didn't pan out the way she expected. But I still think there were points in the game where she was in the majority and was at least aware of what was going on. Where early on, she was in a pretty good spot in the original Bello tribe where she was working with the women and Brando that allowed them to hold the numbers there had they ever gone the tribal, but they don't. After the swap, she seems to have a majority on paper where she has a lot of her original tribe. Though at the same time, there were definitely some danger spots with her where Bruce was picking up on the fact that she was against him. Also, Jake and Caleb were potentially going to work together to be swing votes. And also, we do see that Bruce finds an idol right before the merge, and Keturah is literally the only person on that tribe that doesn't know about the idols. So I do feel like there are definitely some danger spots for Keturah had they gone to tribal, but again, they don't. And then we get to the merge where she is part of the majority during that first vote where they initially target Caleb, but then after Caleb shot in the dark hits, she agrees to vote out J-Ma at that point, which is fine. But then we get to the split tribal, which is definitely the turning point for her game where she was a swing vote at that tribal where she could have chosen between fighting to keep Caleb versus potentially taking out Julie in that spot. And she does ultimately decide to take out Caleb and keep Julie in the game, which is a questionable decision on paper and one that really allows the Rebas to take control of the game moving forward. And we see that playing out where the Rebas are able to take out the likes of Kelly and Kendra, these people that were very close to Keturah earlier in the game. And this also being in a spot to where Keturah doesn't really target the Rebas, where instead during the Kelly round she's targeting Jake. During the Kendra round she ends up losing her vote during the challenge there, so it's not like Keturah is able to put up this fight as her own closest allies from earlier in the game are being taken out. So I don't think that aspect is particularly great to Keturah's game. Though with that said, I think Keturah herself was intentionally enabling the Rebas, where she recognized that her actions in the game were allowing the Rebas to get deeper into the game, and this was part of her own strategy of latching herself onto the bottom of the majority alliance in the hopes that the Rebas would eventually fracture and she would be able to capitalize on that fractures to better her own position. And again, I do have to give her at least some respect for having that idea. Though with that said, it doesn't really work out for her in that way, where while the Rebas do ultimately fracture at the final 7, and that culminates in the next few rounds with Emily going out the final 7, Drew going out the final 6, I don't think Keturah herself is really driving a lot of these votes. And also, I don't think the jury is seeing this division in the game as Keturah's moves, to where I feel like even if Keturah had gotten to the end, I don't think she would have gotten the credit for causing the Rebas to fracture, as it felt like they were always going to fracture at some point anyway. And then you also have the final 5 round, which is a complete mess for everyone involved, but for Keturah in particular, she ends up making a pretty questionable decision in taking out Julie over D. And while I understand her not fully trusting Jake in that spot and being sus of his intentions, I still think her not taking the shot at D in that position was a misstep to say the least. And the fact that she also flipped her vote at the last minute when it seemed like she was willing to write down D's name until the tribal actually happened is also not a great look for me. And then she ultimately loses the fire making challenge in the final 4 in a position to where I don't think she wins if she had won that fire making challenge anyway. So either way, it is a pretty messy game where while I do respect the creativity that she employed in the game with her trying to employ the strategy, I just don't think it really worked out by the end. And I think she just really gave up a lot of control in the game while not really able to reclaim that control. And I feel like that makes it very hard for me to have her game too high, but still it's the fact that she played a pretty intentional game that leaves her here at number 35. Now moving on to number 34, and we have yet another person who I wouldn't consider to be that dominant of a player and someone who was in and out of the majority of points. So at the same time, I feel like there are some impressive elements in her game. But number 34, we do have Kara from Survivor David vs. Goliath. And Kara is someone I've also talked about in a previous video, that being my David vs. Goliath videos. And I feel like Kara's game for the most part is just kind of fine, where she's someone who does spend a decent amount of the game in the majority, but is also someone who wasn't overly effective in the game, and there were still points where she was on the out. Now, early on, she was in a pretty good spot in the original Goliath tribe, where she was clearly in the majority there and is clearly part of the Jeremy vote, the one vote they go to. But then her position weakens after the swap, where despite the Goliaths having the majority on paper, she ends up being flipped on at the tribal that they go to, where Alec ends up flipping to the Davids. And in doing so, she ends up losing Natalia, who was one of her closest allies. And I feel like Kara probably would have been the next to go had they ever gone back to tribal, but they don't. But then we get to the merge, where I feel like Kara's game is kind of up and down for a while, and even at the points where she's in the majority, she's not really dictating where her side is going with a lot of things. Where first up, the Goliaths are where the Glyes are able to hold the numbers at the first vote by taking out Elizabeth and taking advantage of the division with the Davids. That was a pretty straightforward vote there, but then the Davids outplayed them in the following round by pulling off a minority vote split to snipe out John, which is obviously not great for Kara's side of things, but then Kara's able to recover a bit by aligning with Alec and Allison and also distancing herself from Dan, who was becoming a liability for her, and she is part of the vote split to split the votes onto Dan and Angelina. The following tribal to take Dan out after Dan's idol gets nullified. But then at the following round, she's forced to cut Alec after Alec becomes a pretty big threat. So I feel like that's a net negative for Kara's game. But then we get to the final 9, where she is able to be part of this plan to blindside Carl after Christian and Gabby flip. And while I don't think Kara was the mastermind behind this plan, where I feel like the likes of Mike and Christian were more so behind that move, I still had to give Kara at least a little bit of credit for being part of that. But then the final 8, she's part of this plan to target Christian by piling all their votes onto him, only for Christian to have an idol played on him. But despite that, Mike and Angelina are able to pull their votes onto Gabby to ensure that she goes out instead, which again is kind of a mixed bag for Kara. And then she's in the majority for the next 2 rounds, where she does vote out Christian at the final 7 and Davey at the final 6. But then we get to the final 5, where from that point on, I feel like Kara's in a pretty precarious spot where, despite her wanting to go to the end with Mike and Angelina, it becomes pretty apparent that Mike and Angelina are closer to Nick and would rather go to the end with him. And despite her also being close to Allison, she is forced to cut Allison at the final 5, only for her to be targeted at the final 4, where she ends up being taken out in fire there. So not a great endgame for her, where it does feel like by the end she ran out of runway, and it feels like she was going to an endgame that was not beneficial for her. And also feel like even if she got in the final 3 that she wanted, that she more than likely loses that to Mike probably. And even against Nick, she probably loses to him as well. So I do feel like by the end, Kara was kind of drawing dead, both in terms of her getting to the end, but also in her winning at the end. And missing in the fact that I don't feel like her game was overly impressive, where while there are definitely some impressive elements to her game, like the fact that she was able to rebound after the Glyes got blindsided at the John round, I feel like outside of that, I feel like Kara was not an overly dominant player, mixing in the fact that there were still points where she was on the outs, and it's kind of hard for me to have her too much higher here than number 34. Now moving on to number 33, and we have someone who I feel like has certain similarities to Kara, but I feel like they were in the majority for a lot more of their season compared to her. But at number 33, we actually have another new era player, and that person is Liz from Survivor 46. And Liz was a bit debatable for me. I did have a debate over where exactly to have her here, as I think she's someone who was probably in the majority for more of a run than the people we've already talked about in this grouping, and was also more independent minded than the likes of a Christina or Jan or Denise, in the sense that I feel like Liz was probably playing a bit more on her own compared to those people who are more so just content to be on the bottom of the majority groups. Though at the same time, I still think Liz was still not in the greatest position to actually get to the end, where despite her working with the majority, she was still not in that great of a position. And I also question her win equity as well. That also makes it hard to have her too high here. Though with that said, I still think her game is fine for the most part, where early on she's in a decent enough position on the original Nami, where while she isn't running things, she is working with Tevin and Hunter, and had they gone the trouble early on, she would have been pretty safe there and would have worked with them to target Soda there. That's pretty good. And then when she finally goes to tribal after the merge, she's pretty safe for those first few rounds, where she's in the majority to take out both Mariah and Soda there. But then she does decide to flip on Tevin and Hunter afterwards, where she does vote out Tevin at the final 10 and Hunter at the final 9. And I've talked about this before in my 46 player ranking, but while I do think her voting out Tevin does make sense for her for the most part, I do think she probably should have kept around Hunter a bit longer, as I feel like she could have kept Hunter as a shield more, and I feel like Hunter's someone who's probably a bit closer to Liz than the likes of Charlie or Ben. And I feel like through her voting out Hunter, it does essentially pit her into working with Charlie and Ben moving forward. And while that's a position that allows her to get all the way to the final 4, it's not really one that allows her to get all the way to the final 3, which I think is an issue there. And I don't think Liz herself does that much to improve her position with that alliance, where while she does vote with them moving forward, taking out Tiffany at the final 8, winning it to the final 7, where she very much wants to target Q at that point, only to be convinced by Charlie into flipping the vote onto Venus instead, where I feel like that move was pretty bad for Liz in particular, as I feel like Venus is someone who Liz could have more easily beaten at the end, and I think keeping around Q as his clear smokescreen only benefits someone like Charlie, who should be this massive threat in the game, but through Q and Maria staying in the game, that does forced the likes of Liz to target them over Charlie and allowing Charlie to get deeper into the game, and at the same time allows them to pin her as his massive juror throughout the final four, to where she ends up being targeted by pretty much everyone in that spot, where she's forced into fire and ends up being taken out there. And it's sort of weird, as she is viewed at the end as this massive jury threat by the people within the game. However, I'm not entirely convinced if she is that big of a jury threat, where one of her strategies coming into the game was to spread this lie about how she was rich and she owned all these businesses and that she didn't need the money, all in an effort to get people to drag her to the end thinking that she would be this goat, where at that point she would reveal to everyone Final Tribal that she wasn't rich and that she actually was deceiving them the whole time. And I think it's kind of funny how her strategy essentially backfired, where it does seem like people in the game did see her as his threat by the end of it, to where they wanted to take her out. Though at the same time, I don't feel like we've gotten much confirmation over whether she would have actually won a jury vote had she gotten to the end. And plus, even if she had gotten to Final Tribal, I think her reveal that she actually is now rich probably would not have gone down the way that she thinks, where I think it's just very hard to change perceptions at Final Tribal after she had spent an entire month coming off as pretty pathetic and also someone who just talks so openly about not needing the money, to where I think it would have been very hard to convince a jury just based off that to award her with the win. So on the whole, I'm still very confused about Liz's actual win equity at the end. But the reason she's at least here on the list is, while she is technically in the majority for most of her run, and while she's never truly blindsided, at least until the end, I feel like she doesn't really have that much agency in the game. And I think when she does make certain moves, I think those moves don't really benefit her, where I feel like her voting out Hunter was not in her best interest. I think her voting out Venus at the final 7 is also not in her best interest. And the fact that no one was taking her to the end as well by the end of it makes it very hard for me to have her too much higher than number 33. Now moving on to number 32, and we're moving on now to a different grouping now of several players who were all part of majority alliances for most of their runs. And I feel like they weren't necessarily at the bottom of those alliances either, and probably had some agency within them, though that said, probably not to the same extent as people who are higher on this list. But at number 32, I did decide to go with Sundra from Survivor Cook Islands. And Sundra was actually someone I debated having lower, closer to where Denise and Jans were, as I feel like she probably had less agency within her group compared to certain other people in this grouping. Though after thinking about it, I feel like she still had a pretty clear path to the end that definitely defines her more so than the people below her. Now, if we're going through her game, she has a pretty decent start on her original Hiki tribe, where she's probably the majority to take out Seiku. Though with that said, she is the secondary target of the tribal, though with it being majority woman and Nate and Seitu acting like they were like the providers of the group, it made it pretty easy to vote one of them out there. But then once that tribe is dissolved, I feel like she is on the bottom for a decent amount of the pre-merge, where she is on the outs during the Cecilia vote, where she does vote for Becky there. And then afterward, she's mostly kept around due to there being other pariahs on their tribe, and like the Cowboy and Flicka. Though with that said, she does do good enough work in integrating with the majority to where she's at least kept safe during those rounds. But then we get to the mutiny, where Penner and Candace do decide to flip over, and that essentially forces that remaining 4 to stick together. And that essentially puts Sundra into an alliance that allows her to get through the rest of the game, where while they do face adversity along the way and get pretty lucky by the bottle twist, the I-2-4 are eventually able to get the majority after the merge that allows them to control the game in the post-merge. Though with that said, I feel like Sundra had very little to do with the I-2's game control, where obviously they were helped by Ozzy being very dominant challenges, and then you'll be able to pull over Penner with the idol at the merge vote itself to ensure that they get the majority on that Nate vote. So I feel like Sundra herself was probably the least involved in the I-2-4 success, but she does still benefit from that good success, where they are able to pick off the remaining raros one by one until it's just the I-2s left. And then she gets to the final 4 in a spot to where Ozzy is the biggest threat, to where had Ozzy not won immunity, they would have voted him out. And considering that the season ended in the final 3, that means that Sundra would have gone to the final 3 and not been a final juror. But through Ozzy winning final immunity and Yule also having his god idol that he can use at the final 4, that essentially forces a fire-making challenge between Sundra and Becky, and Sundra ends up losing it, albeit barely, and ends up losing instead. So it is a bit of an unfortunate end to Sundra's game here, to where I feel like the fact that she was at least in a position to get to final tribal had Ozzy not won final immunity is at least a bigger pro than I can give her than the people similar to her that are lower on this list. Though with that said, I still think Sundra didn't really do that much in the game, where just by her being in this alliance that allowed her to get to the final 4, it's one that she kind of had to be in considering the situation that they were in by the time of the mutiny. And I feel like with her not really doing much to allow the I2s to take control of the game after the merge, I can't really give Sundra that much credit for the Alliance's success, mixing in the fact that I don't think she wins as she gets to the end, where even if she had won that fire making challenge, I think she still loses to Yule and Ozzy, where the only vote I can even see her getting is Rebecca's, but even then that's not enough. So I feel like it's for all those reasons that despite Sundra having these minor pros to her game, I still decided to have her in this grouping here. And with her having the least impressive resume of the people in this grouping, I do have her at the bottom of this grouping. So it's for that reason that she is here at number 32. Now moving on to number 31, and I think this may be controversial that I had this person so low, especially with how beloved this person was at the time of their season. But at number 31, I actually have the original final juror of Survivor, and here we have Rudy Bosch from Survivor Borneo. And Rudy's game is very difficult for me to assess here, where yes, he is part of this alliance, that being the Toggy 4, that does essentially control the game for the merge on. And I feel like with him also getting to the final 3 in a spot to where there's talk about how he would have won against anyone at the end, I think those things are at least somewhat worth mentioning. So with that said, I still think there are plenty of holes within Rudy's game that makes it very hard for me to have him too high here. I think the biggest knock to his game is his early game, where early on, before the alliance comes together, he is on the bottom of Toggy, where a lot of that does stem from him being on the older side of things, where obviously that makes it hard for him to get by, where he is almost the first boot of the season, where he barely survives in a 4-3-1 vote, or even Richard doesn't vote with him, instead voting for Stacy there, but he scrapes through that. But then we get to the next tribal, the Stacy tribal, where he is targeted once again. And this is a very weird situation where, if you don't know, there are allegations that Rudy was meant to go home in this tribal, but then production nudged Dirk and Sean into flipping their votes to Stacy there, which eventually resulted in a lawsuit from Stacy after the season. And obviously this is a very wonky situation, as if this is to be believed, then it means that Rudy was saved by production here in a spot to where he would have been the third boot of the season otherwise, which is obviously a massive knock to his game here. Though with that said, I'm still not 100% sure if it's fully true, where while I think there may have been some communication between production and Sean and Dirk in this particular tribal, I don't think it's really that explicit. And I feel like there isn't really enough evidence to fully say that Rudy was outright saved by production here. So I'm not really sure what to make of that aspect to it, but it is still a knock to his game, the fact that he was targeted in that spot anyway. But then afterwards, the alliance does come together, where Rudy is the fourth person pulled into that alliance, and they're able to control the Dirk tribal at the next tribal they go to, and then after the merge, they're able to stick together to get their way, especially after Sean decides to employ his alphabet strategy, to where they're able to manipulate that to vote out the Bagong members, and obviously Rudy is part of all that, but at the same time, I don't really think that Rudy himself is controlling a lot of these votes, where I don't really get the sense that Rudy himself is dominating this group, where again, he was literally the last to be pulled into this alliance here. Not to mention that he's benefited from this being such an early season of the show, where there wasn't really that much coordinated opposition until very late into the season. That also benefited Rudy as well. So again, not really sure how much to really give Rudy a lot of credit here. But he is eventually able to get down to the final 4, where he ends up winning immunity there. Though at the same time, I think he also gets lucky by Kelly flipping on the revote. He got sued there, where I feel like Richard staying in the game is obviously beneficial to Rudy in that regard, and keeps around someone who would have taken it to the end. Though that with that said, we get to the final 3, where Richard does decide to throw fall immunity, assumably because Richard didn't want to take Rudy to the end, but also didn't want to betray Rudy. And also at the same time, Kelly didn't want to take him to the end either. And once Kelly wins immunity, he's a goner there. So I do feel like by the end, Rudy was pretty unlikely to get to the end, and was also pretty unlikely to win fall immunity as well. So again, not really sure what his prospects were for actually getting to the final 2. Though with that said, he did have some equity on the board. I think he would have had a decent shot of winning the season had he gotten to the end, where we have heard people talk about how people were willing to vote for Rudy in that spot. So I do have to give Rudy at least some credit for that. Though with that said, I don't think he had a super solid path for getting to the end outside of having Richard take him to the end, where I feel like Richard was not very willing to go out of his way to take Rudy to the end there, as we see in the Final 3 challenge. But even beyond that, I think the main reason he is this low on the list is his early game, where I still think I had to take the Stacy tribal into some consideration here, as again, there is a very real possibility he could have been the third boot of the season had production not gotten involved there. And I think mixing in the fact that his game beyond that is not overly dominant, where while he is part of this group, he's not really driving a lot of the action himself. I feel like those things were enough to have him not too high here. So because of that, I do have him here at number 31. Now moving on to number 30, and we have another person who I would categorize in this group. And we're actually going for just one season here. And here we have Keith from Survivor, the Australian Outback. And I think Keith is in a pretty similar position where he is also part of this dominant alliance, is able to control a lot of the action, especially in the post-merge, but I think also in the pre-merge as well, where I do think that Keith is in a pretty interesting position for a lot of the season there, where early on, while he certainly annoys plenty of his tribe mates, he's able to remain pretty safe during both the Kel and Magdod tribals without too much difficulty. But then we get to the following round where he and Tina are able to flip Colby to their side, to where they're able to take out Mitchell at that round. And from that point on, that becomes a pretty solid core group that is able to have the majority on the Oga core tribe moving forward. And then after the Oga cores take the numbers after the merge, that core is able to have control of the majority there, which is all pretty impressive there. And they are pretty effective at picking off the Kuchas one by one, while also going for Jared the final 8 and Amber at the final 6, which I have criticized those moves in the past. I feel like had this been a later season of the show, that this could have opened things up for them to be flipped on, but again, with the Kuchas not really getting their act together, it really didn't do that much damage to their game. But really, Keith is part of this dominant trio that is able to dictate a lot of the action. And I think in some ways you can argue that Keith is getting his way more often than someone like Colby, where particularly during the Jerry round, I feel like that's something that Colby did not want to have happen, but Keith did, and I feel like Keith got his way there. So I do find like that's somewhat impressive there. And I think that demonstrates that Keith definitely has agency within this group, despite him being the least likely of them to win, which obviously ties into some of Keith's drawbacks, where Keith is obviously someone who isn't well liked by his tribe, someone who doesn't really win if he gets to the end, and the fact that he is willing to go to the end with Tina and Colby, both of whom would be him, is all pretty bad there. But I think the biggest knot to all this is that despite Keith being the least likely to win, neither Tina nor Colby want to take him to the end, where we see both of them seeing him as this undeserving person, how they want the good people to win, and in doing so, Colby is so ready to cut Keith after he wins that final immunity challenge, which is obviously pretty bad on Keith's end. The fact that Colby was willing to take the harder road and going up against Tina versus taking Keith to the end. And supposedly Tina would have done the same had she won final immunity, where she also was going to cut Keith as well. And I think that's a massive hole to Keith's game. The fact that he was willing to go to the final 3 with people who he was not going to win against, but also people who didn't even want him in the final 2 despite that fact. So I do feel like that's a pretty massive hole to Keith's game. The fact that he had just 0 win equity on the season is a major reason why he is this low on the list, mixing the fact that he also had a pretty poor social game where he wasn't very well liked either, and I don't think he really did much to really help himself. But still, the fact that he still had at least some agency within the game, and the fact that he was at least part of this core alliance for pretty early on in the game, was enough to have him at least this high on the list and not lower, but still not too much higher than number 30. Now moving on to number 29, and we have yet another person who fits into this grouping of people who are in these majority alliances, but we're not necessarily the most dominant players within that. But at number 29, we actually have another new era player, and that is Heather from Survivor 41. And to me, Heather is someone who was in the majority for pretty much the entire season, albeit she's still someone who doesn't have that much influence in how the game actually plays out, but also doesn't have the same knocks that people like Rudy or Keith have. But early on, she's safe enough on the original Luvu, where while the show makes it seem like her and Heather were on the bottom and would have been targeted had they gone the tribal, in reality they were working alongside Danny and Deshawn, and had they gone the tribal, they would have gone for Sydney there. Though at the same time, I feel like Erica probably had better connections to Danny and Deshawn compared to Heather there, to where I feel like Erica was more prioritized in that group over Heather there. But still, they get to emerge unscathed, where at that point she is part of the majority for those first 3 rounds, picking off the old Yases. Though at the same time, she's not really dictating those votes, and she's also not part of Shan's alliance that is controlling a lot of those early votes. However, we then get to the split tribal, where at that point, Erica and Heather do get a 1-up on Shan by convincing her to target Nasir there. Though at the same time, she was a secondary target at that tribal, where it ended up going to a tie there, which isn't great, but she ends up surviving that. But then we get to the final 8, where her and Erica are able to team up with Xander and Ricard to flip the game on Shan there, taking her out. Though at the same time, I would give Ricard more credit for that move going through, and I feel like Heather is more so there for the ride. But from that point on, she is part of this majority alliance, is able to dismantle Shan's power structure, taking out Leon at the final 7, Danny at the final 6, And then she's part of this flip at the final 5 to take out Ricard, who was the biggest threat left in the game. But then she gets pretty unlucky at the final 4, where Xander wins immunity and decides to put her in a fire against Deshawn, where she ends up losing there. So not a great end to her run, but at the same time, I still think her game is competent for the most part, where she is in the majority for the entire game. Albeit she's someone who's rarely controlling votes, and I think she's more so working as Erica's lieutenant for a lot of the season. But at the same time, I think Heather also had a lot of win equity to where I think if she had gotten to the end against anyone other than Erica or Ricard, she probably wins. Where I do think against Deshawn and Xander, she is the favorite to win that jury vote. So I do think she still had win equity by the end of the season. And I think her game is a bit better than what the show demonstrated. But at the same time, I think with her not having a lot of direct control in the game, was enough to have her here at number 29. I'm moving on to number 28, and we have yet another person who was in the majority alliance for most of their run, but is another person who didn't have the most agency by the end of it. By number 29, we actually have Jenna Lewis, and this is her game from Survivor All-Stars. And I think Jenna's another person who was in the majority alliance for pretty much her entire season up until her boot round. And at least had some agency early on, though by the end of it, I think she kind of gets outplayed. Where early on, she's a pretty big driver on the Saboga tribe, where she is leading the charge and targeting the winners. And she leads that first vote, taking out Tina there. Following round, she is once again the majority to take out Rudy. But then afterwards, her tribe is later dissolved, and she, along with Rupert, joined Chapera, where at that point they were able to build an alliance with Rob and Amber that does become the majority alliance moving forward, where we do see Rob and Amber decide to stick by Jenna and Rupert all the way to the final 4. And I do find that somewhat impressive. The fact that they are able to align with the power players on the season is all pretty good. And really, Jenna is someone who doesn't have to do that much moving forward. We're coming to the merge. They're able to pick off the old Mogo Mogos, taking out Lex, Kathy. They are in the majority to take out Alicia the following round, along with Sheehan. And again, Jenna is in the majority alliance for all that. Though with that said, I don't think she's really the one driving the votes, where I feel like Rob is more so the leader of that alliance. And she never makes a flip against Rob and Amber either, where there was this opportunity to flip at the final 5, where Tom was leading the charge against Rob and Amber, though she's not really on board for that. Takes out Tom there. Final 4, same thing, where she has this opportunity to side with Rupert to vote against Rob, though she ends up not doing so, which is obviously a weird situation, as even if she did flip, it would have only been a tie. Not to mention the fact that Rupert was also a pretty big jury threat at that point, so you can at least understand why she would want to take him out before the end. Though at the same time, it's still not great that she's going to a final 3 with a blatant duo, and sure enough, once she fails to win final immunity, she gets voted out herself. So obviously, it's a weird spot where she's in the majority alliance for pretty much the entire game up until the end. Though at the same time, I feel like she wasn't well positioned to actually get to the final 2 in the alliance that she chose to stick with. And she also turned down opportunities to flip against Rob and Amber when she had the opportunity to do so. And I'm also not sure if she wins if she gets to the end, where even though Rob was someone who had a lot of people angry at him, I don't think she wins against Rob if she got into the end, considering that Sheehan would have been against her. Even Kathy wasn't a big Jenna fan either, so I don't think Jenna would have been likely to win against Rob. And while I think she would have had a better shot against Amber, she didn't even want to go to the end with Amber, where had she won final immunity, she would have gone with Rob. So I do think by the end, she didn't have the greatest path to actually winning by the end, but still it's the fact that she was in the majority alliance for pretty much the entire season. And as someone who wasn't exactly at the bottom of the alliance either, was enough to have her here at number 28. Now moving on to number 27, and we have yet another person who was in the majority alliance for a lot of their season, and also another person who didn't have that much agency within that group, but was at least someone who was trying to flip by the end of it, even though they were unsuccessful. But at number 27, we do have Ashley from Survivor Redemption Island. And Ashley is someone who, again, was in the majority alliance for pretty much the entire season up until she gets taken out, where she is obviously part of Boston Rob's alliance on the Open Tebe group. And really, there isn't that much to say about her game for a lot of it, where she's simply voting with Rob for a lot of it. Votes out Christina right away at the beginning, votes out Matt immediately afterwards, votes for Christina the following round, votes out Matt again at the merge, and once the Ometepes had the numbers, she votes out the remaining Zapateras. There really isn't that much to say about Ashley's game. But by the time it gets down to just Omotepes, we do see her stepping up her game a bit, where we do see her pushing Rob to target Grant at the first Final 5 round, which ends up going through after she wins immunity there. Also votes out Andrew at the second Final 5 round. And we also see her pushing the likes of Natalie to try to flip against Rob himself, only for that to be unsuccessful where Natalie just sticks by Rob. And once she fails to win final immunity, she gets taken out herself there. So obviously the fact that she does run out of runway by the end of it, the fact that she enabled Rob for so much of the season is not great, and obviously made it more difficult for her to cause the flip that she wanted to have happen. But with that said, she still at least tried to flip. She wasn't purely blindly loyal to Rob. And I think there were still some points where she had some agency, particularly during that grant round. And I also think she would have had some respect by the jury had she gotten to the end, where I think in a Natalie Phillip final 3, she clearly wins that. And I think even against Rob, there could be an argument that she gets a lot of votes there from the old Zapateras there. And while I don't think it would be enough to win, I think the Zapateras did have some respect for Ashley by the end of it, as being one of the bigger threats outside of Rob within the Ometepe group. So I do think there are at least some impressive elements to Ashley's game, and while it's not enough for her to be higher on this list, it's at least enough to have her here at number 27. Now moving on to number 26, and we have yet another person who I feel like fits pretty clearly into this tier, but we actually have the most recent final juror at the time of recording here, and here we have Rizzo from Survivor 49. And I think Rizzo also fits into this grouping of someone who was in a alliance that controlled a lot of the game. Though with that said, I feel like Rizzo's game was probably not as impressive as what it could be. And I also think there are points where he's not really getting his way there. But still, he's someone who's pretty safe early on. We're on the original Uli, he's part of the majority there, has a very close bond with Savannah, though they never go to Tribal. After the swap, they're able to pick up Sophie B, and they're also able to be in the majority for both the Tribals that they attend, taking out Matt and Jason. Though with that said, he is technically the secondary target during the Jason round, but they clearly have the numbers there. Though with that said, his group does lose in numbers at the merge, where everyone finds out about his idol, and they also end up losing out on the Nate vote there, losing one of his numbers there. And I think he gets pretty lucky the following round, the split tribal, where due to him having an idol, it kind of gives him a degree of implicit immunity where people are afraid to put their votes onto him due to him having his idol, to where had he not had an idol, he probably would have just been an easy boot there. But even beyond that, you have Savannah coming to their camp, and through her potentially having the ability to participate in that tribal, that discourages them from even splitting the votes to flush his idols. So I do think Rizzo kind of gets lucky by the situation that allows him to get through that split tribal. But then afterwards, at the final 9, I do have to give him at least some credit for the Alex round, where it does seem like he was pretty active in shifting the target onto Alex there. Though that said, I would also give some credit to Sophie B for that round, but regardless, I'll give Rizzo some credit for that. And then at the final 8, his alliance is able to retake control of the game by pulling in Sophie S to pull off a Jovan blindside, which is pretty good, and then immediately cut Sophie S at the final 7. Final 6, they're once again able to get their way by taking out Steven that spot, but then he makes a pretty bad decision at the final 5 by deciding to vet out Christina over Sage there, where I feel like Christina would have been better for Rizzo to keep around there, as Christina was his pretty good firemaker and someone who could potentially take out Savannah at the final 4. But I think by him just caving in to Savannah's wish to keep Sage in the game, it puts Rizzo in a pretty bad spot coming into final 4. And I think just in general, the fact that Rizzo was so confident going towards the end with both Savannah and Sophie B is pretty questionable, as I feel like both of them would have been pretty hard for him to win against at the end. And also the fact that I think his game is all style and no substance, where despite him claiming to make all these big moves, he just remained by Savannah and Sophie B for so much of the game. And I think he also overestimates his idol shenanigans, where while it is somewhat impressive that he's able to keep his idol in the game for so much, despite it being a public idol, it's also in a spot to where I think a lot of people just didn't see Rizzo as that big of a threat, and hence why they didn't really target him that much during the game. And just in general, I feel like Rizzo is someone who doesn't win in many scenarios at the end, where, while I think he could have won against Christina and Sage, that's obviously not the scenario he was really going for. And I think on top of that, there were also points where he just wasn't getting his way, namely during that Christina round, and also that early merge phase where he was on the bottom for that. And even with the split tribal, him getting lucky there, I think there's enough holes in Rizzo's game to where I can't really have him too much higher than here. But still, the fact that he was in this core group that did have a lot of control in the end game was enough to have him here on number 26. Now moving on to number 25, and this is someone I kind of went back and forth on, as, well, I think there are impressive elements to this person's game. There are also plenty of drawbacks, especially early on, but at number 25, I did decide to go with Erin from Survivor Tocantins. And I think Erin's game is a bit of a mixed bag, where on one hand, she is someone who's in the majority for pretty much the entire post-merge, which I do find somewhat impressive. And I think she's someone who is at least somewhat active within the game, but at the same time, she's not an overly dominant player. And is also someone who had a pretty rocky start to her game, where right away in the original Tambira, she's not in the majority there. She's lumped in with Candace, who becomes this pariah on Tambira due to her being anti-coach. and she ends up losing Candace right away. Now, technically she does vote out Candace there, but at the same time, that was more so to save face. And then she gets pretty lucky the following round that Jerry becomes sick to where they decide to vote him out over her. But then beyond that, she probably would have been the next to go had they ever gone back to Tribal, but they don't. But then we get to the merge, where at that point she does decide to flip to the Jalapal side of things. And from that point on, she's able to remain the majority for pretty much the rest of the game, where from that point on, she's able to work with them to take out a lot of the remaining Timbiras and Brendan, Tyson, Sierra, and Debbie. And before the final 5, she's not really talked about as a target either, which is also pretty good there. Now, she is the secondary target at the final 5 round, but again, they had the numbers to get through that. Same thing at the final 4, but again, they had the numbers there. And she's really in a spot to where, had JT not won the final 2 immunities, she more than likely gets to the end, where it does seem like Steven was ready to cut JT had he not won one of those immunities and gone to the end against Aaron. Though at the same time, I do think Aaron probably loses to Steven had they gotten to the final 2 anyway, where I feel like she probably would have had a better chance of winning against Taj or Coach, but obviously she voted out those 2. And then she's eventually taking out final 3 once JT wins immunity, which you can falter to a degree as JT decides to vote her out over Steven when it seemed like Steven was the bigger player between the 2. Though at the same time, I think JT was able to weaponize that final tribal to make Steven look like the bad guy. So I don't really know how much to fault Aaron for that aspect to it. But still, I find Aaron's game at least somewhat impressive. The fact that she knew what she needed to do at the merge to flip over, to take out the tribe that was planning to vote her out. And while she does get lucky that Jerry got sick and that her tribe didn't go to tribal more, I still think Aaron was at least somewhat active in the game and was at least somewhat able to make her fate in the game. But she just got unlucky that JT won those final few immunities that resulted in her getting cut. But still, I find her game at least good enough to have her here around the middle of the pack here at 25. Now moving on to number 24, and we have another pretty mixed bag of a player here. Probably the most mixed bag out of anyone on this entire list. But at number 24, I did decide to go with Kelly Wentworth, and this is her game from Survivor Cambodia. And I think Kelly's game has some pretty impressive elements to it, but also some pretty big drawbacks that make it hard for me to really assess where she should truly land on this list. But still, it was at least somewhat interesting to look at her. Now, early on, I think she's in a pretty safe spot in her original Takeo tribe, where she's probably the majority to take out both Vitas and Shireen, which, again, is just kind of fine for her. But then afterwards, she gets 2 pretty bad swaps in a row where she's on the bottom of both of them. Probably gets voted out had they ever gone to tribal, but again, she's able to avoid tribal all the way until the merge. But then we get to the merge where she's initially in a pretty rocky position, where while she does want to work with the likes of Cass and Sierra, both of them become pretty big targets right at the bat, and Wentworth isn't really able to save them and is forced to latch onto the split vote plan to take out Cass there, which isn't great. At the final 12, she becomes a pretty big target herself to where she needs to play an idol to save herself, which is obviously one of the biggest Knockstar gain. The fact that she needs an idol to save herself that far back in the game is not great. However, their side is able to get their way there in taking out Savage. But then afterwards, her along with the Witch's Coven are able to reintegrate to a degree where they're able to be part of the Kelly Wigglesworth blindside the final 11. And the final 10, they even do a lot of work to pull in the Stephen Fishback blindside where they're able to get the numbers there. However, that is thwarted after Jeremy finds out about the plan and decides to play his idol on Stephen, negating all those votes and sniping out Sierra, who was one of Wentworth's allies there, which isn't great. However, at the final 9, she is successful in taking out Stephen after Spencer pulls her into that plan, which is pretty good. And at the final 8, she's part of the plan to take out Joe. So I do feel like that stretch of the game from the final 11 through the final 8 are all pretty good for Wentworth, where despite her having been such a big target at the final 12, the fact that her and the Witch's Coven were able to regroup after that to control the next few rounds is all pretty good in my eyes, and I do have to give Wentworth at least some credit for that. But then at the final 7, she is flipped on where she does end up losing Abby Maria there, who was one of her allies there. That's pretty bad. At the final 6, she's able to flip Kimmy to her side to try and blindside Jeremy, but then Jeremy finds out about the plan and plays his idol to save himself. But then Wentworth also has to play an idol because she was the target from the other side, resulting in a deadlock. And then her side loses out on that tiebreaker where Kimmy ends up going out there. That's pretty bad. And really from the final 5, she's a pretty big target. Where at the final 5, she wins immunity. Would have been voted out had she not won said immunity, but she does. And then final 4, loses immunity, gets voted out. So obviously not a great end to her run. And just in general, I find Wentworth's game very difficult to assess, where while there are plenty of points where she's playing actively and is getting her way, there are just as many points where she's on the bottom, where I feel like there was a decent stretch in the pre-merge where she was in danger. She obviously had to play her idol at the final 12 to save herself. and then she needed to win out at the end. So I do feel like her game is pretty rocky and a bit of a roller coaster, but at the same time, I feel like she was still a pretty active player and also someone who had a lot of win equity, where I feel like she wins for sure against anyone at the end other than Jeremy. And even against Jeremy, I think she has a decent shot there as well. So I do feel like Wentworth is someone who had a lot of respect from the players within the game and is also someone who was definitely playing pretty hard. The problem is that there were plenty of points where she wasn't really getting her way, and she also needed certain things to save herself to where I can't have her too high here, but still it's the fact that she at least had some agency within the game. That leaves her here at number 24. Now moving on to number 23, and we have yet another player who I feel like was pretty active during a lot of the game, but was not necessarily in the best position for a lot of it. But we actually have another pretty recent final juror here, and that is Camilla from Survivor 48. And I think my view of Camilla's game has gone down a little bit since the season has aired, though I still look at her game as pretty decent for the most part, despite her not being the most dominant player on the season. Early on, she's relatively safe on the original Siva, where she wasn't in danger going out had they ever gone the tribal early on. Though with that said, I feel like the likes of David and Kyle were in better positions on that tribe compared to her, where while the show makes it seem like that Kyle and Camilla were these ride or dies right from the start, in reality, Kyle was much closer to David for a lot of the season, and it wasn't until David blew up his game later on that he started working more so with Camilla. So I do think Camilla was not the leader of that tribe, but was still pretty safe there early on. Obviously, afterwards, they get a pretty bad swap, but I feel like Camilla plays that pretty well, where she's able to build good enough bonds with the majority loggies to where, one, they decide to keep her safe over Kyle, where they decide to target Kyle. But then beyond that, they're able to do pretty effective work at convincing Thomas to not use his vote steal, but also concealing their idol that allows her to play pretty effectively at tribal, where she hands it off to Kyle, Kyle's able to play the idol, and in doing so snipes out Thomas, which is all pretty good on Camilla's end. And then she also does pretty good damage control afterwards with the loggies, to where they're not upset at her, and they even want to work with her and Kyle moving forward, to where that does end up becoming the majority alliance after the merge. And after the merge, she is in the majority alliance, where she has pretty good connections with both Kyle and Shaheen that keep her relatively safe there, and she is voting with them. But again, it's in a spot to where she's not really the key decision maker of that alliance, where I feel like the likes of Joe, Eva, and Kyle are more so making the decisions there, and Camilla's more so at the mercy of whatever they end up doing there. But she is voting in the majority for a lot of this merge here, where she does vote out Charity, Cedric, and Chrissy. During the David round, she is targeted by David due to her connection with Shaheen, where David wanted to weaken Shaheen, and while she does have the backing of that alliance to take out David there, that's obviously not great there. We get to the final 8, where she does attempt to make a flip by pulling in Mary, Star, and Mitch to try to flip the game on Joe, and is unsuccessful at that, largely due to Mitch not wanting to go through with it, and also Star being seen as an unreliable ally. And while Joe wins immunity anyway in that spot, still not great that she was unable to get her way there, and she ends up getting towards the end with a power structure that doesn't really benefit her, and we even see her losing Shaheen at the final 6 with her being on the outs for that vote. And even Kyle, someone who was her closest ally by that point in the game, didn't seem that willing to go to the end with her, where we do eventually see him winning immunity at Final 4 and decides to put her into fire against Eva there, to where she ends up being taken out that spot. So not a great endgame for Camilla, where she does eventually run out of runway by the end of it. And beyond that, she is still someone who, despite her being in the majority for a lot of the game, and despite her being at least somewhat effective at certain points, was still unable to drive a lot of the action, where despite her working with the likes of Kyle and Shaheen for a lot of the post-merge, she's not really driving the action of what their alliance is doing, and it very much feels like she isn't getting her way in a lot of the post-merge there, which is obviously a knock against her. But a major pro to her is that she does have a lot of win equity, where the talk is that she would have won against anyone had she gotten to the end, and I'm inclined to believe that, which obviously ties into why she's targeted by Kyle by that point in the season, but still the fact that she had a lot of win equity, but also was someone who's at least trying to play the game, and did at least have one successful move in the Thomas blindside in the pre-merge. I feel like those things were enough to where I did decide to leave Camilla at this point in the list, as I feel like her game does at least have some merit to it, but it's the fact that she wasn't a very dominant player and someone who wasn't really driving a lot of the action in the post-merge that leaves her behind here at number 23. Now moving on to number 22, and we have someone who is pretty similar to Camilla in a lot of ways. And while I think Camilla's probably a better player than this person in the grand scheme of things, this person has a more impressive move on the resume. By number 22, we do have Scout from Survivor Vanuatu. And I think Scout's in a pretty similar position to Camilla, where she is in the majority for pretty much the entire game up until she gets taken out. And it's also someone who was in a pretty decent position within that alliance, but was not necessarily driving the action in that alliance for a lot of the season. where early on she's in a pretty decent spot on the original Yes Sir tribe, where despite her being on the older side of things, we see the older woman taking control right away. They take out Dolly that first round, which is pretty good. And we also see her building a very tight bond with Twyla that gets her through a lot of the game as well. And really early on, she's just in the majority, where she's relatively safe there. They vote out Mia without too much difficulty. After the swap, she's also relatively safe there, where the women had the majority, and they do vote out Bubba. But then she doesn't get her way at the Lisa tribal, where she's one of the only people that doesn't vote for Lisa there, which is not great, but she remains pretty safe afterwards. And then at the merge, we do see her being part of the majority once again, where the women hold the numbers, they get Twyla and Julie back on board, and we see them picking off the men for the next few rounds, taking out Rory at the final 10, Sarge at the final 9, and Chad at the final 8. Though even then, we see Scout and Twyla recognizing that Amy and Leanne benefit from the women sticking together, and that if it comes down to just the women, that they're unlikely to get to the final 3. And we even see them attempting to cause a flip at the final 8, only to later back out of it. But then the final 7 is when they fully go through with a flip, where they do pull in Chris and Eliza to blindside Leanne there, which is pretty good for Scout there, as it does improve her position over what it would have been had she stuck with the woman. Now, with that said, I don't think Scout deserves sole credit, as I do think Twyla and Chris also put in good work to pull in Eliza there to get this split to go through, especially considering that Eliza didn't like Twyla or Scout, but due to Eliza literally being targeted, she was able to flip over there, and they were able to control things for the next few rounds, where despite some wavering from Eliza at the final 6, they're able to hold the numbers to take out Amy there, and even after Eliza flips at the final 5 to join Julie, they're able to maintain Chris's loyalty to ensure that they're able to take out Julie there, and Eliza at the final 4. But then we get to the final 3, where despite Scout being there with Twyla, who have been her closest ally for the entire season pretty much, we see Chris being able to steal Twyla away from Scout, where Chris is able to make a final 2 with Twyla that Twyla does uphold to. And we know now that had Twyla won final immunity, that she would have taken Chris over Scout, which is a pretty big knock to Scout's game, as it's a clear case of Chris outplaying Scout in that position, where Scout should have been able to hold on to Twyla considering their connection throughout the game. But through this, Scout gets into a final 3 where she has to win final immunity, which wasn't happening considering what that final immunity was. And she is eventually taken out after Chris wins immunity. So not a great end to her game, where while she did have this pretty big move on her resume and being part of the Leanne blindside at the final 7 that allowed her to take control of the game, I think she kind of let her foot off the gas by the end of it, to where she allowed Chris to make a final 2 with Twyla that Twyla was going to remain true to. So I do feel like that aspect to her game is not great. Mixing the fact that before the final 7, while she was pretty well positioned within the women's alliance, she wasn't really the core driver in that force, and that had the women gotten all the way down to it, that she probably would have been cut before the final 3. So obviously there are knocks to Scout's game, and that's why I don't have her too much higher than there. But it's the fact that she was at least well positioned for a good amount of the game, and also the fact that she was part of that big move at the final 7 that allows her to be in a better spot, was enough to have her at least as high for me, but not too much higher than number 22. Now moving on to number 21, and we have another person who is in a similar grouping of these people who were in pretty decent positions for a lot of the game, and while they weren't the main drivers for a lot of the game, they were still fairly active and still had a few impressive moments. But at number 21, we do have Jonathan from Survivor 42. And again, Jonathan's another player who played a pretty decent game for the most part, was in a pretty decent position for a lot of it, and was at least somewhat active, though at the same time, still have some pretty major holes within their game while not being the most dominant player there. Where early on, he's in a pretty good spot in the original Taku, where he has a pretty good relationship with Omer and Lindsay out the bat, and they do vote out Mariah at the one tribal they go to. Though with that said, I think he has some questionable social play with the likes of Marianne and Lindsay, to where they do get on his nerves as the pre-merge goes along. Though with that said, I do think he would have been pretty safe had they ever gone back to tribal in the pre-merge. But then we get to the merge, where while he is talked about as a target right at the bat, due to him being this blatant physical threat, I do think Jonathan does pretty good work in countering this, where we do see him building a very strong bond with Mike, and we also see the Takus rallying around him to align themselves with the big power players from the other tribes and the likes of Mike and Drea to comprise the new majority group that dictates a lot of the post-merge. And I do have to give Jonathan some credit for this, though not sole credit, as I do think the likes of Omer and Marianne played critical roles in this as well. But through this, Jonathan is able to reign the majority, where they take out Lydia at the merge. They also take out Chanel at the following tribal. But then we get to the split tribal, where we do see Jonathan being pretty active there in trying to orchestrate this Drea blindside that did seem somewhat likely to go through. Though obviously it's thwarted once Marianne and Drea decide to play their idols to avoid continuing the streak of black players being sent to the jury. And obviously, I'm not going to fault Jonathan too much for that, considering that it was an out of the game moment between Marianne and Drea. Though I will certainly fault Jonathan for how he reacts to the situation, where he tries acting pretty defensive there, which didn't seem appropriate in that situation. And obviously, through that, they do have to vote out Tori instead. And it's also around this stage of the game that he also blows up his relationship with Lindsay, to where Lindsay is more so against him now. We get to the final 8 where he does vote out High, but he's also the secondary target at the tribal, which isn't great. Final 7 is pretty hairy for him as well, where he ends up winning immunity there in a spot to where he's one of only 2 people playing in the immunity, and had he lost it, he would have been in do or die, but he's able to scrape through that, votes out Drea there. But then we get to the final 6 where he is pretty involved with the Omer blindside there, where he and Mike do split their votes onto Romeo there, and by pulling in Marianne in Romeo, they're able to get through that plan, which I do have to give Jonathan a decent amount of credit for, though at the same time he is the secondary target of the tribal as well, where Lindsay and Omer do decide to target him there. And the final 5, he's able to get out Lindsay, but again, he is the secondary target from Lindsay, and it's in a spot where Marianne did consider saving Lindsay by playing her idol on her, to where that would have sniped out Jonathan out of the game, which would have been pretty funny, but doesn't go through. And he's eventually taken out in fire at final 4 after he fails to win immunity there, and it doesn't seem like he would have won had he gotten to the end anyway, as it doesn't seem like the jury had that much respect for him, and I don't think he wins in any final 3 combos. Now, I do think a final 2 against Romeo would have been interesting, but I don't think he wins in any final 3 scenarios, which is obviously not to his game as well. And just in general, I feel like Jonathan's game is pretty similar to the other players we already talked about, where while he was certainly active in the game and while he got his way at certain points, I also think there are plenty of drawbacks to his game, like the fact that he did burn his relationship with Lindsay, the fact that he burned his relationship with Marianne, and the fact that he just doesn't win if he gets to the end there, and also the fact that he was targeted at certain points as well, like during the High round and the Omer round. Obviously, those things aren't great, but I do have to still give Jonathan some credit for certain things, like the fact that he was able to build this majority alliance at the merge that get them pretty safe, despite him having been this big physical threat in the pre-merge. The fact that he did put in a lot of legwork during the split tribal to cause his Drea plan that did seem likely to go through until it didn't, and also his involvement with the Omer blinds at the final 6. So I still think there are some points in the game where you do give Jonathan some credit, to where I feel like he is a step above some of these people that were in these majority alliances but didn't do much within them. I feel like Jonathan was at least somewhat active within that, but I think there are also enough drawbacks to where I can't have him too much higher than number 21. Now moving on to number 20, and we have the final person in this middle tier of these people who didn't really dominate the game at any point, but were still people who are pretty active. But number 20, we actually have Jerry Manthe, and this is her game from Survivor Heroes vs. Villains. And I feel like Jerry fits pretty cleanly into this tier, someone who didn't really dominate the game, but was still someone who played a pretty major impact in how the season played out here, where early on she's part of the majority on the Villains tribe, working alongside Boss and Rob, and they vote out Randy at the first tribal they go to without too much difficulty. But then the following round, her side does get outplayed by Russell after Russell is able to play an idol on Parvati while tricking Tyson into flipping his vote into Parvati and messing up the split vote plan that does result in Tyson being taken out there. But even so, I'm not going to fault Jerry too much for that, as she wasn't really involved in that decision. But then we get to the following round, where Jerry and Coach do decide to flip to the Russell side, where they do decide to take out Boss and Rob there. And I feel like Jerry was a pretty major influence in that actual vote there, which is pretty good. And we do see her working with Russell for pretty much the rest of the game moving forward. Though with that said, I feel like Jerry is not the main decision maker for that group, where I feel like Russell is more so the decision maker. And we even see that the following round, where Russell does decide to flip on Coach, which Jerry was on the outs for there, losing one of her closest allies, which is not great. However, she is later part of the Courtney vote at the last round before the merge. We then get to the merge, where Jerry is the target from the hero side, to where she needs Parvati to play an idol on her, in a position to where Parvati had 2 idols and played one of them on Sandra, which is obviously not ideal, though to be fair, even if the idol wasn't played, it would have only been a tie vote anyway, and considering that Jerry was one of the only viable targets from the villain side, the fact that Parvati played the idol on her was kind of a no-brainer on Parvati's end. But regardless, this does allow the villains to get the numbers after the merge and allows them to start picking up the heroes one by one. And while I would consider Russell to be the more dominant player within the villains group, I still think Jerry was pretty active and was still pretty influential at points, where during the final 8, she was one of the main people pushing to target Candace in that spot, which ends up going through. And then the final 7, she is the swing vote at that tribal, where she is the one deciding between taking out Rupert and taking out Danielle. And we do see her ultimately taking out Danielle there, which I feel like is pretty good for Jerry's game, as I feel like it weakens Parvati and puts her in a pretty prime spot coming into the end game there. And then we do see her taking out Rupert at the final 6 and Colby at the final 5. However, she is eventually voted out at the final 4, mainly because Russell wanted her to be on the jury to vote for him, which is funny considering that she doesn't end up voting for him at the end. Though regardless, it's still not great that she didn't lock in the final 3 with Russell to where it was pretty clear that Russell wanted to go to the end against Sandra. But I still look at Jerry's game here as pretty solid, where she was in the majority for most of the game up until her boot. And while she wasn't the one dictating all the votes, I still think there were points where she was a major influence in the game, where during the Rob round, she was one of the swing votes there that really flipped the game from the Rob side to the Russell side. And during the final 7, she was the key swing vote there that also was a major impact in the end game, as by her taking out Danielle, that really weakened Parvati to where she had become a target, and also just allowed Russell to get deeper into the game there. So I still look at Jerry as a pretty key figure within the season and someone who was playing the game pretty actively. And I still think she had somewhat equity there. Now, I do think she loses at the end against Sandra, but I think had she gotten to the end against Russell and Parvati, she is the most likely winner in that final 3. So I do think Jerry's still someone who had a shot at winning at the end. And I think considering her game outside of that was fairly impressive, I did decide to have her here at number 20. Now moving on to number 19, and from this point on, I would consider this a top tier of the list, as I feel like all these people played at least somewhat dominant games on their season, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 19, we had the person who I would say was probably the least dominant out of anyone here, and was also the person who had the narrowest path to actually getting to the end. But at number 19, we do have Yao-Man from Survivor Fiji, and Yao-Man is someone who I would consider to be a pretty big player on his season, where he alongside Earl essentially dominated the game from beginning to end, where I feel like Yao-Man was a pretty big figure within that. But with that said, I still think Earl was clearly the leader of that alliance, and Yao-Man felt like a step below him in that regard. But still, I look at Yao-Man's game as fairly impressive, where early on he is able to be part of the majority there, and despite him being on the Ravu tribe that goes to tribal after tribal, he's able to remain pretty safe there, voting out Jessica, Erica, and Sylvia without too much difficulty. We then get to the swap, where while he and Earl are down in numbers initially, we do see them pulling in Cassandra, and essentially able to take control of that tribe there. Now mind you, I think there may have been some other dynamics in play, like the fact that everyone was on one beach initially, to where they weren't entirely working with a blank slate when they went over to that other tribe, but regardless, they are able to take the majority there. And then after the merge, they're once again able to remain the majority, where after Dreams flits over, he is part of the majority alliance from that point on, where they're able to get around the 4 horsemen, outplaying them at the Agardo round, and then picking off Mookie and Alex there. And again, I feel like it's Yao-Man and Earl that are able to really run that alliance from that point on in the game. But it's around the final 6 that Yao-Man does start to become a pretty big target, where he obviously makes a car deal with Dreams that incentivizes Dreams to target him. And then he is a pretty big target at the final 6 to where he has to play an idol to save himself, which is obviously not great in the sense that he needs an idol there. However, I will give Yao-Man a little bit of slack for this, considering that this was the first season with the modern immunity idol, and this was technically the first successful idol play in Survivor history, so I will give Yao-Man a little bit of slack there. However, he does remain a pretty big target afterwards, where at the final 5, he wins immunity in a spot to where Dreams probably would have targeted him again had he not done so. And then we get to the final 4, where he's voted out after failing win immunity, and after Dreams goes back on the deal there. So obviously not great in the sense that Yao-Man was a pretty big target by the end of it. And it also doesn't seem like anyone actually wanted to go to the end with Yao-Man, where obviously Dreams goes back on the deal with them, to where he doesn't want to go to the end with Yao-Man. But even Earl, his own closest ally, also doesn't want to go to the end with him. Honestly, those things aren't great, and it doesn't seem like Yao-Man really had a path to the end there, which is not ideal there. And this is also despite him not even being the biggest jury threat, where even if he had gone to the end with Earl beats him at the end. So the fact that no one wanted to go to the end with Yao-Man, while being willing to go to the end with Earl, who was a bigger jury threat, is a pretty big knock in Yao-Man's game there. Though with that said, I still think Yao-Man played a fairly impressive game where he was still in the majority up until the end there. And even with him not having a path to the end, he still had at least some impressive maneuvers, like him playing the idol at the final 6, and even beyond that, being part of the safe vote plan at the Agardo round. I still think those things are somewhat impressive to me, but I feel like other people had cleaner paths towards the end. That leads them here at number 19. Now moving on to number 18, we have someone who I find pretty similar to Yao Man, but is a step better than him in most regards. By number 18, we do have Kathy from Survivor Marquesas. And I think Kathy is another player who was probably not the key driver behind the entire game, but was still a fairly active player and someone who was gaining some legs as the season went along there. So with that said, she was in a pretty rough spot in the original Road to tribe, where it does seem like she was on the bottom there, though they never go to tribal. After the swap, her tribe has the numbers and is largely able to hold the numbers based off that, where while she is the secondary target during the Sarah and Gina rounds, she's able to hold true there, working alongside Nalia and Pascal, and that allows her to get to the merge where her tribe does have the numbers on the offset. However, she's clearly on the bottom of the Road to power structure, where you have the Road to 4 in John, Tammy, the General, and Zoe, while her, Nalia, and Pascal are on the outskirts there. And we even see her being pulled in by Boston Rob with that first round to potentially cause a flip there, though that is unsuccessful, and she is on the outs when Raw gets taken out there, voting for Zoe. But then we get to the final 9, where she's part of this flip that happens, where she's able to pull in Vesepia, Sean, Nalia, and Pascal to flip the game on the Road to 4. And I do have to give Kathy a good amount of credit for that flip, where it does seem like she was one of the more active players in getting that flip to go through there, and through that they're able to blindside John at the final 9, and slowly dismantle the remaining Road to 4 members, taking out Zoe at the final 8, Tammy at the final 7, and the General at the final 6. And she even gets to the final 5, where she's in the middle of 2 pairs between Nalia and Pascal and Vesepia and Sean, and she does decide to take out Sean at that final 5 round. But then at the final 4, Vesepia wins immunity, which is kind of unlucky for her in the sense that it forces Nalia and Pascal to target her in a position to where they would have targeted Vesepia otherwise. However, on the other hand, it also kind of works out for her, as this opens her up to make a final 2 deal with Vesepia that Vesepia agrees to. And through that, Vesepia does back Kathy on that ensuing vote there that results in a tie, and they end up going to rocks there. And she does get a pretty fortunate result with Pascal being sniped out of the game. And I probably would consider this a minor knock to Kathy's game, where, while on one hand it is impressive that she's able to make a final 2 deal with Vesepia that allows her to get into an endgame that's pretty favorable for her, it's also one that she kind of lucked into, where it does seem like she would have voted out Vesepia had she not won immunity. That would have forced her into a pretty bad final 3 against Nalia and Pascal, who are this clear duo. And she also gets pretty lucky that she isn't rocked out of the game herself, to where Pascal gets taken out instead. So again, it's kind of a weird situation. And even in the situation we get where she is able to make this deal with Vesepia, we see the very next round that Vesepia backs out of the deal, where after Kathy drops out final immunity, Vesepia turns around, makes a deal with Nalia, and then Vesepia throws the immunity challenge to Nalia, to where Nalia decides to vet out Kathy there. So even in this better case scenario, Kathy still isn't able to lock in her spot at the end there, which is obviously an issue. And just in general, I feel like Kathy's game is kind of a mixed bag, where while I do think Kathy was still a pretty major factor in that final 9 flip that really improved her position there, and she was still in a pretty decent spot at the final 5, I feel like it's the fact that she wasn't able to truly lock in her spot at the very end that makes it hard for me to have her too high here, mixing in the fact that she was also not in the greatest spot in the pre-merge either, where she was towards the bottom and needed this one to happen later on in the game. Obviously, those things aren't great, but I still look at Kathy as a somewhat impressive player, someone who was able to turn it up later on in the game, and someone who does win if she gets to the end, so I do have to give her that. But still, it's the fact that she wasn't dominant the entire season, and the fact that she didn't have that pathway locked up at the very end, that leaves her behind here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have another player who I feel like played a pretty impressive game for the most part and was fairly active, though at the same time, I think this person kind of ran out of runway as well by the end of it. But at number 17, we do have Sydney from Survivor Co. Wrong, and I think Sydney also fits into this grouping of someone who was a pretty big player in their season, though as someone who ran out of runway by the end of it. Where early on, she's pretty well positioned on the original Braun tribe, where Jason and Scott want to work with her, but even Darnell wants to work with her as well, and she's able to get through each of those first 3 tribals without too much difficulty there. After the swap, her and Jason are able to build pretty good bonds with Debbie and Neil, to where she would have been pretty safe there as well had they gone the tribal, but they don't. After the merge, she's also in a pretty good spot where she's working with the woman, and she's part of the plan to take out Nick at that first tribal. But then her and Aubrey are able to pull off this pretty impressive impressive Devi blindside the following round, which I do have to give Sydney a lot of credit for there, though at the same time she was the secondary target at that tribal, which isn't great, but she is able to remain the majority for the next few rounds, where at the final 8 she is part of the Scott Pollard blindside. Mind you, I feel like she wasn't as critical for that vote, where I feel like Aubrey deserves more of the credit there for flipping Ty to their side there. Final 7, they take out Julia, and they are able to take out Jason at the final 6. But I think for the final 5 on, she's kind of in this weird spot where on one hand, the talk is that Michelle is the biggest target on the board. And I do think had Joe not been medevaced and Michelle had not won the final 5 immunity, that Michelle would have been voted out there. But I also think that would have led Sydney as the clear target for final 4, where by that point, Aubrey had built this final 3 with Ty and Joe. And I feel like had Joe not been medevaced, that final 3 would have held true to where Sydney would have needed to win final 4 immunity. So to that end, I do think Sydney benefits quite a bit from Joe being medevaced, as it leads her into a final 4 spot where Michelle's still the target ahead of her, but now there's one less round for her to deal with in terms of her actually getting to the end. The problem is that she does get pretty unlucky at the final 4 round where Michelle does win immunity. That makes it a pretty clear target. And while Ty did shake things up by forcing a fire making challenge, she ends up being taken out there regardless. So it is kind of this weird spot where I do think Sydney did kind of run out of runway. And while she kind of got unlucky by Michelle winning final 4 immunity, I think that's somewhat negated by Joe being medevaced at the final 5 that even put her in that spot to begin with. Not to mention the fact that I think even if she had won that fire making challenge, that she probably doesn't win anyway, as Scott and Jason were pretty anti-Sydney by the end of their run. So I do think even if Sydney had gotten to the end, she still would not have actually won the game, mixing the fact that she had a somewhat narrow path to even getting to the end to begin with. And I do feel like her game is mostly in line with Yao-Man and Kathy in that regard. But I still think the fact that she was still a pretty active player in the game and someone who was pretty well positioned for a lot of it was enough to have her here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have someone who I also think fits into this grouping here. However, I think this person had more of a path to actually get to the end, but got more unlucky. That resulted in them being a final juror instead. But number 16, we do have Holly from Survivor Nicaragua. And I think Holly is another player who played a pretty impressive game for the most part, and had a clearer path to the end than the last few players we talked about, but still got sniped out by the end of it. Now, she does have a pretty rough start to the season where she's left outside the core of Marty's Alliance, and you have her considering quitting early on, but is able to scrape by through those early rounds, is able to remain pretty safe during both the Wendy Joe and Jimmy Johnson rounds, though with that said, she is on the outs during the Jimmy T round. But I think her game turns up a bit at the swap, where at that point she is able to build inroads with Chase and the other younger players, and is able to remain pretty safe during both the Tyrone and Eve tribals. And I think from the merge on, her group really takes control of the game, where they take out Alina without too much difficulty. She's able to blindside Marty the following round, and she plays a pretty critical factor in the Brenda blindside at the final 10, which I feel like is pretty good for Holly's game there. After that, you do have the double quit, which I would say is a net positive for Holly's game, as Nyanka and Purple Kelly weren't really working with Holly at that point, and it essentially locks in Sash into working with her moving forward. And really from the final 7 on, her group alongside Chase and Sash are able to really run the table there. Though the problem is that Fabio ends up winning those final few immunities, which ends up really biting Holly at the final 4, where you do have Chase and Sash choosing each other over Holly. That does result in her being voted out at the final 4. So in a lot of ways, I do think Holly had a clearer path to the final 3 than the last few people we talked about, where she did have a final 3 with Chase and Sash. And had she been able to get out Fabio at any of those final few immunities, she would have been able to get to the end. Granted, she doesn't win in that final 3, where I don't think she really gets any votes there. And just in general, it's hard to see how Holly gets to the end in a winning scenario there. So you certainly have to knock her for that aspect to it. But it's the fact that she had a path to the final 3 that was thwarted by a seemingly unlikely immunity run that does leave Holly somewhat high on this list, mixing the fact that I feel like her game outside that was fairly impressive, where she was in this core alliance and played a pretty critical factor during certain rounds. That leaves her here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have yet another person who I feel like played a pretty impressive game on their season, probably a more dominant game than the last few people we talked about, and also had win equity, but was taken out due to some unlucky results at the tail end of the run. But at number 15, we do have Maddie from Survivor Gabon, and I think Maddie's someone who played a fairly dominant game on the season. Though that said, there were still some hiccups along the way. But early on, he's in a pretty good spot on the original Fong tribe. They put out Michelle and Jillian without too much difficulty. After the swap, he's also in a pretty good spot where he's able to build a pretty solid bond with Ace and Sugar. And through that, they're able to control the next few rounds, taking out Jackie, GC, and Kelly. And he also should have had the upper hand to take out Crystal at the following round, only for Sugar to flip and blindside Ace there, which is obviously not great for Maddie. And afterwards, he does get a pretty bad second swap that would have put him in some danger had they gone the tribal, but they don't. But I feel like after the merge, Maddie does become a pretty dominant figure, where at that point the Fongs had the majority, and he's still able to pull Sugar back in to where, from that point on, the Fongs are able to dismantle the Onion Alliance one by one. Though with that said, the Final 7 is pretty hairy for him, where you do have Ken trying to split the vote onto him under the guise that Corinne has an idol, and largely gets saved by Crystal deciding to vote for Corinne to have it be a split. However, it's true that does allow Maddie to take control of the game at the Final 6, where at the Final 6, Sugar does decide to flip to work with Maddie there, and working alongside Susie and Bob, they are able to flip the game on Ken and Crystal, taking him out back to back. And he comes into the Final 4 in a seemingly good spot where really he just needs Susie to not win Final Immunity, which didn't seem particularly likely, though unfortunately that does end up happening. But even then, there was a plan in place to target Bob, who was the biggest threat at that point, only for Sugar to flip to work with Bob, largely due to Bob reminding her of her recently deceased father. And through that does cause her to flip on Maddie, causing a fire-making challenge that Maddie does end up losing there. So I do think Maddie does get pretty unlucky at the Final 4 round itself, both in Susie winning Final Immunity, but also the fact that his fate in the game came down to Sugar, someone who was not the most rational thinker in the world. But I still think for the most part, Maddie played a fairly impressive game where outside the Ace and Final 7 rounds, he was fairly well positioned for a lot of it. I feel like he was in a pretty solid position for a lot of the season. And he also had win equity by the end, where I feel like had he gotten to the end against really anyone by the Final 4, he does win the season. So I do have to give him some credit for that, though it's the fact that he was still blindsided at certain points and wasn't entirely safe in the game at all points. That does leave him here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have a pretty notable final juror to get into here, someone who I feel like played a pretty impressive game, though not without its faults. But at number 14, we do have Malcolm Freeberg, and this is his game from Survivor Philippines. And I feel like Malcolm's game here is good for the most part, though I don't necessarily look at him as a sole dominant player the way that I look at some of the people above him on this list. And I still think there are some limitations to go along with it as well. But early on, he's pretty well positioned on the original Mat Sing, where he builds a very strong connection with Denise. And through that, he's able to survive tribal after tribal despite his tribe going on a massive losing streak there. Though, in that said, I still think Denise was in a better spot than Malcolm, where we get to the Angie tribal, where I feel like Angie was closer to Malcolm than Denise was, but yet he's forced to cut her. And then we get to the Russell Swan tribal, where it's Denise who's the swing vote there, where Russell's targeting Malcolm, Malcolm's targeting Russell, and Denise is really the one making the decision there. And while you do credit Malcolm for having Denise choose him over Russell, I still think that points to Denise being in a better position on the original Mat Sing than Malcolm was. After that, he is swapped over to Tandang, where I do feel like he does pretty good work in connecting with the members there to where he would have been pretty safe had they ever gone the tribal, but they don't. And we even get to the merge where he and Denise are part of the split vote plan on Penner and RC, where Penner plays his idol and RC gets taken out there. However, he is then on the outs during the Jeff Kent round, where he and Denise are part of the plan to target Pete in that spot, only for that to not go through, where Lisa and Scoopin do decide to flip to take out Jeff there, which is not great. But then we get to the final 9 where they're able to build an alliance with Scoopin and Lisa that does blindside Artist there and allows that alliance of 4 to take control of the game moving forward. And I would give Malcolm at least some credit for that, taking control of the game there. However, it's also pretty apparent that Scoopin and Lisa are not dead set on this alliance, and we even see them attempting at several points to build other alliances that could have resulted in them taking out Malcolm and Denise sooner. Or at the final 7, you have Lisa and Scoopin approaching Penner with a final 4 deal that they seemed more willing to go through with until Penner turned it down. That resulted in them voting out Penner there over Malcolm. At the final 5, you have Lisa approaching Scoopin, saying that she wants to go to the final 3 with Maria as an easier beat than Malcolm and Denise, only for Scoopin to turn that down because Scoopin thinks he can beat anyone at the end. And I can't really give Malcolm too much credit for getting Lisa and Scoopin to stick by them when it was pretty apparent that they were willing to go in other directions. Not to mention the fact that they also saw Malcolm as a pretty big threat in general, and I do feel like Malcolm's navigation through the endgame is a bit wonky in my eyes, largely for those reasons. And then you have the Final Four round itself, where he essentially causes Denise to turn on him by not committing to Denise about going to the end with him. That later results in Denise voting him out of the Final Four once he loses that immunity. So I do feel like you also have that knock against him, the fact that he had a path to the end and Denise wanted to take him to the end, up until he made it clear to Denise that she should turn on him at that point. So obviously those things are not great. In general, it's those things that make it hard for me to have Malcolm too much higher in this list, as I do feel like in general, Lisa and Scoopin are probably more integral to the Alliance's dominance in the end stretch of the season, and I feel like Lisa and Scoopin are probably a bit more dynamic in how they could maneuver around the end game, more so than what Malcolm was able to do. Though with that said, I do think Malcolm had a ton of win equity on the season, where I do feel like he was the biggest jury threat by the end game, and had he just gotten to that final three, I do feel pretty confident that he wins a jury vote at the end. So I do feel like that's something to at least credit him there, mixing the fact that I do feel like he was at least an active player. But with that said, he was not the most dominant player on the season as well, and it's for that reason that I have him here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have a player who I kind of look at similarly to Malcolm in the sense that he was a pretty active player and was probably more influential in how the game actually played out. Though with that said, I think his positioning in the earlier stages of the game was a bit rockier than Malcolm's. But number 13, we do have Rob Cesternino from Survivor The Amazon. And I feel like Rob was a pretty big player in the season and someone who I think played a pretty impressive game for the time that he played. Though with that said, it's still not perfect, where I do feel like he was in a pretty rough spot early on the original Top Bikini tribe. While he was voting the majority there, he wasn't really in the core group there, where I feel like Roger was more so running that tribe, whereas I feel like Rob was on the bottom of the majority, and I don't think he really had the agency to drive a lot of those votes there. However, I think his game turns up a bit at the swap, where at that point he's able to integrate pretty well with the women there, built a pretty strong connection with Dina, and they're able to be in the majority for the one tribal they go to, voting out Shauna. And that even extends to the early merge, where he's part of the Roger blindside right at the merge, and he also votes out Dave immediately afterwards. But then we get to the Dina round, where he's obviously forced to cut Dina in that spot, largely due to Dina making herself a bit of a target there, and obviously I do have to knock Rob a little bit for that. And I think he's in a pretty similar spot in this section of the game to what he was in his original try, to where while he is in the majority group, he's not really in the core of that, and he's not really the one dictating a lot of the votes. And we even get to the Final 7 episode where Alex literally tells him that he's the fourth in the group, which is pretty funny there. But it's also around this point where he does flip the game, where at the Final 7, he's able to pull in Matthew, Butch, and Christy to blindside Alex in that spot and really takes control of the game there, which I find pretty good. And he's also a pretty major influence at the Final 6 to vet out Christy there, which is a bit more controversial, as it's in a spot to where he is voting out the swing vote there, which was a pretty innovative move at the time. Though with that said, Christy's also not really that big of a threat to win the game, to where I felt like Rob probably should have kept Christy around simply to have an extra number and also someone who would be easier to beat down the line. And yes, while this was in a spot to where Christy was flip-flopping and wasn't really like committing to one side, I still think he probably should have taken a shot against Jenna, especially after Jenna gave up immunity as well. I do think he probably still should have voted out Jenna there, especially now seeing that Jenna went on to win the last few immunities anyway, but obviously he couldn't have known that at the time. But regardless, he does still play a factor in the Christie round. Final 5, he votes out Heidi without too much difficulty, and on Final 4, he votes out Butch. But again, it is Jenna winning those last few immunities that does him in, where we get to the Final 3, where while he does try to make a deal with Jenna to take him to the end, she doesn't accept it. And at the point where she beats him in that immunity challenge, she votes him out there. So I still think Rob played a fairly impressive game for the most part, where I do feel like he dominated the game from the Final 7 through the Final 4 round. But it's the fact that he wasn't really driving the action from earlier in the game, and also the fact that he doesn't fully lock in the likes of Jenna or Matthew to take it to the end either, where another factor is that Matthew does throw the Final 3 immunity so that he doesn't have to make the choice to take him to the end there. I do have to knock him a bit for that, but I still think Rob was still a pretty impressive player, and also someone that I think would have won had he gone to the end against Matthew. I do think that was enough to have him here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone who played a pretty similar game to Rob Cesternino, and funnily enough, it's from the very next season, and here we have Johnny Fairplay. And I feel like Johnny Fairplay's game is pretty similar to Rob's. In fact, Fairplay even said that he modeled his game after Rob Cesternino, and I definitely feel like you can see that influence in how he approaches the game here, and I also think they were in fairly similar positions for a lot of the season, where early on he is part of the majority of the original Drake tribe. Mind you, he is outside the core of that, where I feel like the core of the Drake tribe is Sandra, Rupert, and Krista, whereas Fairplay is more so on the outs of that. Though with that said, he's able to build a pretty tight bond with Trish that's able to get him through a lot of those early rounds where they do vote out Burton and Michelle. But then the following round, he does attempt to flip the game on Rupert, but is unsuccessful. He ends up losing Trish in that spot, which is pretty bad for him. And he also gets pretty lucky by the Outcast twist, where had that not happened and the merge just happened normally, that Sean would have flipped that point and the Morgans would have had the numbers there, which would have put Fairplay in a pretty bad spot. However, instead we get the Outcast twist. Sean ends up being taken out at the last round before the merge. And then after merge, the Drakes are able to get the numbers, where at that point, Fairplay is part of those first few rounds, taking out Savage and Rhino. Mind you, he is the secondary target during the Savage round, but again, it's in a spot to where they have the numbers. But similar to Rob Cesternino, he's in a spot to where while he's voting in the majority, he's not in the core of that group, where again, the likes of Sandra, Rupert, and Krista are still the core of the Drake group at that point. However, Fairplay does a pretty decent job at countering that, where he's able to build a tight connection with Burton and Lil, and they're eventually able to flip the game on Rupert at the final 8, where I do have to give Fairplay a lot of credit for that. And really, Fairplay is in control for the next few rounds, where he does vote out Tawana at the final 7 and Krista at the final 6. But then he does lose control at the final 5, where he ends up letting go of his relationship with Lil to the point where Lil ends up flipping against him, and even votes for Lil that tribal as well, trying to target her. And it's through that he does end up losing Burton there, being blindsided there, which is pretty bad for him. And while he's able to get through the final 4 round, we get to the final 3 where neither Sandra or Lil are taking him to the end. And we even see him trying to make a deal with Lil at that point, but Lil just doesn't respond to that. And he ends up being voted out after Lil wins final immunity. So obviously not a great end to his run there. And I think there is a serious debate between Fairplay and Rob C here, in the sense I feel like their games are pretty similar for the most part, where they both have their ups and downs. The reason I decided to give Fairplay the edge here is I feel like Fairplay was probably in a better spot from earlier in the game, where even the pre-merge, while he wasn't in the core group, he still had a tight connection with Trish. And then during the early merge, he was able to lay the groundwork with Burton and Lil that allowed him to cause that flip at the final 8. So I feel like those things give Fairplay the edge for me, even though I feel like their games outside of that are fairly similar. But it's for that reason that I do have him here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we're moving on to yet another player who I feel like played a pretty dominant game for the most part, even though they weren't the sole dominant player on their season. But there are still some holes in their game that keep them from being in the top group. But at number 11, we do have Sarah Lucina, and this is her game from Winners at War. And I feel like Sarah played a pretty impressive game for the most part, where I feel like she had a ton of agency in how the game played out. Though that said, I feel like she was outplayed by Tony by the end of it. Where early on, she's pretty well positioned on the original DeCall tribe, working alongside Tony and Sophie, where she's very much a part of the plans early on. First splitting their votes on Amber and Kim at the first tribal they go to, and then voting out Tyson at the next tribal they go to. After the swap, she also remains in a pretty good spot there, where they vote out Boston Rob at the one tribal they go to. And then after the merge, she is once again in a very solid position, where she's still working alongside Tony and Sophie, and she's able to be a part of the early plans, taking out Wendell at the first tribal, Adam at the next, and they do vote out Tyson once again at the following tribal. So I do feel like up until the final 9, Sarah is playing a pretty solid game, where she's very much part of the action, she's well positioned, and I do feel like she is able to remain fairly safe for the most part. But then we get to the final 9, where she is blindsided there, where Tony's able to orchestrate the Sophie blindside and leaving Sarah completely out of that. And I feel like it's a case of Tony completely outplaying Sarah in that spot, and also a case where it now locks Sarah into working with Tony moving forward, whereas before she had more options there. So I do feel like that was a net negative for her game. And moving forward, she is working with Tony, where she still is part of the plans to vote out Kim at the final 8. She splits the votes on Jeremy and Michelle at the final 7, and she votes out Nick at the first final 6 round. Though it's in a spot to where I feel like Tony is clearly the alpha in that group, and I feel like had they gotten to the end together, that Tony probably beats her. But then we get to the second final 6, where Natalie does re-enter the game, And from that point on, she is facing more adversity as now they had to take out Natalie, though is unable to do so due to Natalie having idols. And while she does remain pretty safe at the second Final 6 round, voting out Denise there, we then get to the Final 5 round where she makes a pretty questionable decision where Natalie has another idol that makes Michelle the secondary target, and she was on board initially to vote out Michelle there, but then Ben decides to lay down his game where he asks Sarah to vote her out in the hopes that it would put a move on Sarah's resume. And Sarah does go through with this, where she votes out Ben in a 3-2 vote, leaving Tony out of it. But it's also a decision that makes it less likely that Sarah actually gets to the final 3. Whereas if she had just kept Ben in the game, it not only takes out Michelle, who was a number for Natalie, and thus leaving Natalie all alone in the game, but also means that even if Natalie were to win final immunity, that she would just put Ben in the fire against Tony, which would be a much better situation for Sarah to be in, as Ben would likely beat Tony in fire, and Sarah would get to a pretty favorable final 3 against Ben and Natalie, where she would more than likely win. However, by voting out Ben here, it not only gives Natalie an extra number that could potentially keep her safe at final 4, but it also makes it more likely that Sarah ends up in fire against Tony, which ends up happening here when Natalie does win final immunity. And while both of them were pretty bad at fire, Tony does edge her out there, and through that she ends up being the final juror. So by the end, I do question her decision at the final 5 round that I think ultimately cost her the game, which is ironic as Ben was doing it to try to help Sarah there, but whatever. But I still find Sarah's game here mostly solid, where I do feel like she was still very much in the majority for most of the season, working alongside Sophie and Tony for a lot of it, and also feel like she was very well positioned within that, where so many people had very solid connections with her to where she remained relatively safe for so much of the season. But I still think it was in a spot to where Tony outplayed her at the final 9 round. I think she was also a bit too willing to go to the end against Tony as well, in a spot to where I think Tony beats her, considering that Tony was outplaying her. And I think with her also making that decision at Final 5, it just made it less likely for her to actually get to the end to begin with. So while I think she still played a pretty solid game, I think it's those blunders that leave her here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have yet another person who I feel played a pretty impressive game for the most part. However, I feel like they lost steam by the end of it. But number 10, we have Lauren from Island of the Idols. And I think Lauren's another player who played a pretty impressive game for a lot of it, was also pretty well positioned for a lot of the season. Though I think by the end she was outplayed by Tommy. Now early on she is very well positioned on the original Vokai tribe where she's clearly within the majority there and is able to get through the Molly round without too much difficulty there. After the swap she is in a bit of a wonky situation where her side is down in numbers initially, though her and Tommy do pretty decent work at pulling in Aaron and Missy to where had it been a natural vote that they likely would have gotten the numbers there. However, that's all for naught after Elaine is able to play her vote block from her IOI visit that essentially forces Aaron and Missy to stick by their original tribal numbers, and through that she does lose out on the Jason round, which is not great. However, I think it's her connections with Aaron and Missy that would have kept her pretty safe had they ever gone bad to tribal, to where had they ever gone bad to tribal, it would have been between Tommy and Dan over who goes out, but obviously it never comes to that. But then we get to the merge, where at that point, they are able to retake the majority, and from that point on, Lauren and Tommy are essentially running the game, where first up they do blindside Kelly, after that they split their votes on Jamal and Karishma, take out Jamal there. But I think the split tribal is where she does start to lose some ground, where she does end up losing Aaron and Missy back to back, where she does actively vote out Aaron at her side of the tribal, while Missy gets voted out on Tommy's side, which I do feel like is a pretty big blow to Lauren's game, as I feel like those numbers were more critical to her game than they were for Tommy. And I think you can extend this further to the Elizabeth round that happened immediately afterwards, where granted that was caused by an idol play where Karishma was the main target, but played an idol that caused Elizabeth to be the backup target there. But then we get to the final 8 where there was supposedly this plan in place to blindside Tommy. And while Lauren wasn't a part of that, the fact that that plan did fall through by the end of it is still not great for Lauren, as Tommy was her biggest adversary in the game that she would have needed to get out before the end if she herself wanted to win. And really, throughout the entire endgame, Tommy's just in a better spot compared to Lauren, where while Tommy does end up losing Dan at the final 6 due to Dan being Dan, I still think Lauren is still not in the greatest spot there, where while they do vet out Jan at the final 5, it's in a spot to where had there not been an idol nullifier that Lauren would have been the target there after Jan played her idol. And then at the final 4, Tommy outplays her directly, where she ends up convincing Nora to keep him out of fire and instead put her in the fire instead, to where she does end up losing there. So I do feel like Tommy does outplay Lauren by the end of it. And I do think the fact that Lauren does end up losing Aaron and Missy there really enables Tommy to outplay her by the end of it. And I think we also see that at the final 4 as well. I do think Lauren is still someone who played a pretty impressive game for the most part, and I think had she gone to the end, she would have had a decent amount of win equity. But it's the fact that I think Tommy outplayed her by the end of it that makes it hard for me to have her too much higher than number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have the final person in this penultimate tier here of people who play pretty impressive games, but were not sole dominant presences there. But number 9, we do have Ian from Survivor Palau. And I feel like Ian fits in pretty clearly with the likes of Sarah and Lauren in the sense that he was part of a pretty dominant alliance and had a lot of agency within that alliance. And it's also someone who had a clear shot of winning the game had he had just gotten there. Where early on, he is in a very solid spot in the original Juror tribe, where he is very much in the core power structure there. And they do without Willard at the one tribe they go to before the eventual merge. And then after the merge, he is once again in a pretty good spot where he's able to pick off a lot of the outsiders, taking out Kobe at the first tribal. They get pretty fortunate by Janu quitting the game immediately afterwards. And they do vote out Stephanie at the final 7. And really before the final 6, there isn't really that much to say about Ian's game as, again, he is very much in the center of things, working alongside Tom and Katie there. And also the fact that they just don't go to tribal that much in the pre-merge, so there's that at least. But it's around the final 6 that he does finally step up his game. Where at the final 6, we do see him being able to get a 1-up on Greg and Jen, where it's in a spot to where Katie was the swing vote, and he and Tom are able to pull in Katie there to ensure that they do survive on the eventual vote. They vote out Greg. At the final 5, they also take out Karen there, someone who was also not in the core structure, but also someone who was closer to Tom than she was to Ian. And I feel like the fact that Ian was able to get out Karen in that spot is clearly an indication that he was able to get a 1-up on Tom there. And really from the final 4 on, we do see Ian attempting to target Tom, where Tom is the biggest threat left on the board, only for Tom to win those final 3 immunities, which does disfavor Ian there. And then you have the final 4 round itself, where Tom does find out that Ian was targeting him and does decide to target him in return. That does result in a fire making challenge. And while he does blow out Jen in that fire making challenge, it also puts him in a rougher spot in the final 3 to where now Tom is more likely to target him in that spot. And when they get to the final immunity challenge, which does end up going for nearly 12 hours until Ian decides to give up his game for Tom, which is obviously the biggest nod to his game, the fact that he does give up at the end of it. And while he was in a pretty rough mental space at that point, considering that Tom and Katie were mad at him, I think the fact that Tom was able to manipulate him into giving up his game in exchange for their friendship is obviously not great by the end of it. But I think taking that aside, I still think Ian played a pretty impressive game for the most part, where again, he was very much a big player on there. And I still think there were points where he was outplaying Tom. And I think had Tom not won those last few immunities, that he would have been able to take the shot against Tom and come into a much more favorable endgame that he would have won. To where I feel like had he gone to the end against anyone other than Tom, that he clearly wins the season. So I do feel like Ian still played a pretty impressive game, though it's in a spot to where he was unable to make the move by the end of it, and obviously gives up by the end of it. So it's for that reason that I do have him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and this is the top grouping here of people who either played sole dominant games on their season, or people who had a lot of potential in their season, but got very unlucky by certain situations, and it's just a matter of ordering them. By number 8, we probably have the most flawed out of this grouping here. By number 8, we actually have the earliest final juror left on the board, and here we have Lex, and this is his game from Survivor Africa. And I feel like Lex was probably the first person in Survivor history to play like a sole dominant game, where he is someone who had a ton of power on his season and was clearly the head of his alliance from pretty much the start of the season to the end. Though that said, there was still some bumpiness along the way, where early on he is clearly in the majority in the original Baron tribe. They vote out Diane and Jesse without too much difficulty there. We then get to the swap where he is obviously disfavored initially, where it's only tied in numbers, but they're able to get a 1-up on them after figuring out that Lindsay was the one on the Samburu side with previous votes. That does allow them to win on that eventual tiebreaker there. And you also have to credit Lex for not getting any votes himself there. That does allow him to get through to the merge. And then we get to the merge where the Bronze have the numbers from that point on that should allow them to steamroll considering the previous 2 seasons. However, there is still plenty of wonkiness within that, where while they do vote out Clarence at that first round without too much difficulty, he also does end up getting a vote from T-Bird that later causes him to go on this massive witch hunt the following round, and he ends up blaming Kelly for voting for him. And this ends up burning his relationship with Kelly, where Kelly was someone who was more willing to work with him, but through him blaming her for the throwaway vote at the Clarence round, this causes her to actually turn against him and also causes her to rally most of the Sand Brews against him to where he ends up almost being taken out here in a position to where it was largely self-inflicted. The fact that he turned Kelly against him, the fact that he made himself such a big target for that round, and he ends up being saved here by something outside his control, where Brandon decides to counter Kelly's flip by flipping to the Baron side, mainly because he was against Frank and didn't want to be seen working with Frank, someone who was homophobic. And while Lex certainly had a good relationship with Brandon, I can't really give Lex that much credit for flipping Brandon here, considering that Brandon was so anti-Frank that he was probably likely to flip anyway. So I can't really give Lex that much credit for saving himself when he had already done enough bad to make himself the target to begin with. But really from that round on, he is able to retake control of the game where, while he doesn't vote out Brandon when he goes out, from the final 7 on, he's clearly in the power position where they do pick off a lot of the remaining Sand Brews there. And then it gets to a seemingly decent final 4 position where you do have a pretty easy target in Kim Johnson there if she doesn't win immunity. And while Big Tom is someone who had floated the idea of flipping against Lex earlier in the season, I feel like he wouldn't have pulled the trigger at the final 4 round, and even if he wanted to do at the final 3, he would have had Ethan by his side to stick by him, so really he would have just needed Big Tom to not win final 3 immunity there. So I do feel like Lex was in a okay endgame spot. However, he does get very unlucky by Kim Johnson winning those final 2 immunity challenges, both of which were due to wonky circumstances, where at the final 4, Kim wins the Fallen Comrades challenge, mainly due to a production oversight where the final question was one that had multiple correct answers, but production didn't realize that, and they gave the point to Kim over Lex when it should have been a tie, and had Lex won that tiebreaker, that they would just vote out Kim Johnson there. So through that, he does get unlucky. They vote out Big Tom there. And then the final 3, you have Kim winning the Hands on Hard Idol challenge due to Ethan falling out after seeing a production member getting sick off camera, and then Lex himself falling out due to him also not feeling super well. So again, another challenge that Kim didn't seem that likely to win until she did win the challenge. And through that, Kim does vote out Lex there due to her having the better connection with Ethan at that point. And you do have to fault Lex for not building more of a connection with Kim himself to where Kim could have taken him to the end over Ethan. Though at the same time, the fact that Kim was there to begin with is not something that seems super likely at the offset. So really, I do feel like Lex played a pretty impressive game for the most part, a pretty dominant game. However, it's still one that had plenty of issues within that. And while I think he got unlucky by the final 4 situation and obviously Kim winning those final few immunity challenges, I feel like that's somewhat negated by the fact that he made himself the target the final 9 round and played pretty poorly there. So really it kind of evens out to him being at the bottom of this top grouping here, where while I still think he played a pretty impressive game, I feel like the other people above him played better games. So it's for that reason that I have him here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have yet another player who I feel played a pretty dominant game, particularly in the post-merge, though there were still some bumps along the way. By number 7, we have Rodney from Survivor Worlds Apart. And Rodney's another player who I feel was a pretty big force on his season and someone who definitely had a lot of control in the post-merge. Though with that said, it was still not a clean ride throughout. Where early on, he's in a fine enough position on the original Blue Collar tribe where he's probably the majority at the Lindsay tribal, though he is the secondary target there, which is not ideal. And he also gets a fine enough swap where the Blue Collars hold the numbers there. Though with that said, he also tries building a connection with Joaquin and is eventually blindsided when Mike flips a vote on Joaquin at the one tribal they go to there, which is honestly not great. So while it's not a terrible pre-merge, it's in a spot where he's not really in control of things, and he's even on the outs at one of the tribals he goes to. But I feel like his game really turns on at the merge, where while the Blue Collars do lose out on the initial vote, largely due to Jen playing her idol, really from the merge on, the Blue Collars are able to hold the numbers, where they're able to pull in Will. And I think Rodney really stands out at that point, where he is able to build this very solid alliance with Will, Dan, Carolyn, and Tyler that essentially becomes the core moving forward, where they're able to pick off most of the remaining no-callers in Haley, Joe, and Jen. And I feel like Rodney's really the one in the center of the game at this point, where had that alliance been able to run the table moving forward, that he would have been pretty primed to win the season, where he had a final 3 with Will and Dan, and I feel like had that been the final 3, that he would have won the season. However, he's largely thwarted by Mike going on a massive immunity run, where Mike ends up being immune from the final 9 on, winning 5 of the last 6 immunity challenges, and also having an idol for the one round where he doesn't win immunity. So it's a very unfortunate situation for Ryan to be in, where he was actively targeting Mike from the final 9 on, but just unable to get him out at any opportunity. and at the same time losing some of his numbers along the way, where at the final 6, he attempts to target Carolyn, only for Carolyn to play an idol, in the process losing Dan, who was one of his goats there. And while he's able to get his way at the final 5, where he's able to pull in Mike to target Sierra, we then get to the final 4, where Mike wins immunity again, and at that point does decide to target Rodney, and while he does have Will by his side to force a fire-making challenge, he does end up losing that fire-making challenge. And even if he had won it, he would have been at the end against Mike, who he does lose to in a jury vote. So I do feel like Rodney does get very unlucky with how his run ends, where even though he was in a very prime position to dominate and win the game, he gets very unlucky by Mike going on this massive immunity run that ultimately ends his game at the very end. And for me, that's the major reason why I did decide to go with him over Lex, where even though Lex had more consistent control throughout the entire game compared to Rodney, I feel like Rodney made fewer mistakes compared to Lex in terms of his decision making, and I feel like he also got more unlucky in how he ends up being a final juror on the season, even though he wasn't necessarily in control for as much of the game compared to Lex, but still the fact that he didn't have as much control in the pre-merge, that makes me leave him here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have yet another player who I would say played a pretty dominant game on their season. However, they still didn't necessarily get their way at all points. By number 6, we have David Wright, and this is his game from Millennials versus Gen X. And I feel like David is yet another player who I feel like plays a very impressive game on his season, though there are still some points where he is not getting his way and was still being targeted at certain points. Where early on, he is fine enough positioned on the original Gen X tribe, where even though he's not the core driver on the Rachel or Paul Walker votes, he's still safe enough and building decent connections there. However, I feel like his game really turns on at the Lucy round, where he does decide to play his idol on Jessica, saving her in the process, which is obviously a big move for him to be making so early in the season, and one that definitely could have painted a target on his back. However, I feel like he's able to manage to fall out of that pretty well, while in the process securing Jessica's loyalty for the future. Though with that said, he also gets a less than favorable swap, where he is forced to cut Cece at the one trouble they go to there. But then we get to the merge, where I feel like from the merge on, he does become a pretty big power player for the rest of the game, where first up, he's able to link up with Adam, Hannah, and Zeke to take control of those early rounds, taking out Michelle and Taylor, and he's also part of the flip of the final 11 to blindside Chris. But then we get to the final 10, where Zeke and Will do flip on him to build their own group consisting of the people who are on the outs of the Chris vote. And this does put David in a rough spot, where it does result in a deadlock and a rock draw, where David does end up losing Jessica in that spot, which is obviously not great for David's game, as he does lose out in that situation. However, he's able to win out the following round, where Will does flip back to take out Zeke. And mind you, a lot of that was due to Will trying to employ this pendulum strategy, where he wanted to flip to take out the big threats. In doing so, Will also saw David as a big threat for down the road, but still, David's able to get a 1-up on Zeke there. But then we get to the final 8, where Will does flip again, this time trying to target David as another big threat. However, David is able to hold the numbers that time to take out Will there. However, really from the final 8 on, I would say David is a pretty consistent threat throughout the end game here, where he obviously is targeted at the Will round. He's also targeted at the Sunday round, the final 7. Though again, he's able to hold the numbers there, holding on to Adam, Hannah, and Ken there. At the final 6, he's also talked about as a target, but is able to win immunity. And we get to the final 5, where Adam flips on David there, trying to target him, but is unable to pull Hannah to his side. And I'm not really sure how much to give David credit for holding on to Hannah there, considering that, yes, while David is a pretty big threat, it also makes sense for Hannah to keep David around, as it does guarantee that Hannah gets to the final 3 by keeping David around for the final 4. And I think we see that play out the final 4, where Hannah does decide to join Adam and Ken in voting out David at that point. So David's in a pretty rough spot here, where on one hand, I feel like he would have had a pretty tough path to getting towards the end, where the fact that even his closest allies in Ken and Hannah do flip on him by the end of it probably makes it so that he has a pretty narrow path in terms of getting to the end, mixing in the fact that there were still points early in the game where he didn't get his way, particularly during the CC round and the rock draw round. However, I still look at David as a pretty big player in the season, someone who didn't necessarily need immunities at all points, even though he was targeted at certain points. And he's also someone who had a lot of win equity as well, where had he gotten to the end, he wins against everyone there. So I still look at David as a pretty impressive player on his season, but still those holes in the fact that he didn't have control at all points that makes me leave him behind here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have yet another pretty impressive player, someone who had a lot of win equity, and also someone who was a pretty big player on their season. However, I still have a couple small reservations with them being at the very top of the list. By number 5, I did decide to go with Jesse from Survivor 43. And obviously, Jesse is someone I've talked pretty highly about in my Survivor 43 coverage and in my top 10 players of the new era videos. And I still think Jesse played a very strong game on his season. Though with that said, I still have a few minor knocks to his game, where right at the bat, he is very well positioned on the original Vessi tribe, where he and Cody are essentially in the center of that tribe. And those two are very much the decision makers to vote out Justine, the first tribal they go to. But then afterwards, they are forced to cut NECA at the next tribal, which is obviously not ideal for Cody and Jesse, as NECA was more closely aligned to them than they were to the Noel and Dwight side. However, it was mostly due to NECA being a challenge weakness there, but still they're able to avoid tribal again until the merge. We then get to the merge where Cody and Jesse are once again in the center of the game, where they're very much working with the Coco side of things while still having inroads with the other side, particularly having a final 3 with Gabler that allows him to remain pretty safe. Not to mention that Cody is so loyal to Jesse that he even lets Jesse hold on to his idol for a lot of the post-merge, which is still pretty insane to think about, but regardless, they are very much in the driver's seat, taking out Ellie, Dwight, Janine. During the split tribal, they are the main decision makers to devote out Ryan after seeing what happened on the other split tribal where James went out. At the final 8, Jesse is a major factor in the Noel blind side. And at the final 7, they vote out Sammy without too much difficulty. And really throughout this entire game, Jesse is able to remain pretty safe, being very well situated on the tribe while still being a major player in dictating a lot of these votes. However, it's also in a situation to where people seem to be giving Cody more the credit for the moves that the duo are making. That makes it so that if Jesse and Cody had gotten to the end, that there's a serious chance that Jesse loses to Cody, which later results in Jesse pulling the trigger on Cody at the final 6, which is obviously a masterful move. The fact that Jesse's able to pull in the likes of Gabler, Cassidy, and Owen to pull out this move, all while still being able to hold on to Cody's idol to use for himself at the final 5, is all very impressive in my eyes. And I do have to give Jesse a lot of credit for that. And I also feel like it's a move that would guarantee that he would win the game if he gets to the final 3 from that point on. The problem, though, is that him making that move also elevates his threat level, and we really see that play out at the final 2 rounds, where at the final 5, it seems like he would have been in a lot of danger had he not had the idol to use on himself there. He does play the idol, and then he is eventually taken out at final 4 after he fails to win both the immunity challenge and the fire making challenge, where it does seem like no one really wanted to take him to the end at that point. And he also was pretty bad at competitions as well, to where he didn't really have much of a fighting chance to win either of those challenges. So I feel like Jesse's game is difficult to assess, as on one hand, I do have to praise him for the amount of control that he has during a lot of the game, his positioning up until the final 6, the amount of agency he has in all these blind sides that I do have to give him credit for there. And I also have to praise him for recognizing that he needed to cut Cody if he wanted to win the game, that he would need to pull the trigger and make that move. And I do have to at least praise him for taking the risk of taking out Cody while still having a path to the end. But on the other hand, I do feel like it is a failing on him in 2 regards. One, in the fact that he doesn't guarantee his win against Cody, where I feel like he could have done more to ensure that he would win against Cody so that he didn't have to make the Cody move to begin with. But beyond that, also the fact that he didn't seem well equipped to get to the end once he made the move, where he didn't lock up the likes of Gabler to take him to the end even after that move. He also doesn't have the comp ability to win at the point where he is being targeted. So I do feel like those downsides make it so that I can't really have him at the top of this list here, where even though I do have to praise him for the amount of agency he has across the game, and also the fact that by the end he was the biggest story thread, I feel like it's those minor knocks that leave him behind here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have another player who I feel played a very impressive game and was definitely a sole dominant player on their season. But number 4, I did decide to go with Rafe from Survivor Guatemala. And I feel like Ray was another player who I feel played a very impressive game on his season, where he essentially dominated the game from beginning to end and still had at least one winning scenario, though not as many as other people in this top grouping. But still, I feel like Ray played a very strong game, where early on he's in a very solid spot in the original Yasha tribe and is part of the plan to take out Morgan and Brianna at those early tribals. After the swap, his group is able to hold the numbers, and he's once again in a very prime position working alongside Stephanie. They vote out Brooke and Margaret at those 2 tribals they go to without too much difficulty. And then after the merge, his swap tribe has the numbers there. And from that point on, they're able to hold the numbers there, pagonging a lot of the other side, taking out Brandon, Bobby John, and Gary, though at the same time cutting other outsiders like Jamie along the way. And it's in a spot to where Rafe is essentially the leader of that alliance, where he is the best positioned within that group. He's also the safest in that group to where he's never targeted. And he's also in the best spot to get towards the end had that group hold together. But it's around the final 6 where I do start to take more issue with his game, where on one hand, he is able to build his connection with Danny, who by that point is the last remaining Yasha member, and he does agree to keep her safe and builds a final 3 deal with her. And obviously that's good in the sense that it does ensure that Danny works with him and doesn't target him, despite him being this massive power player for the majority group. But on the other hand, it's him keeping Danny that results in him cutting people that would have been easier for him to be at the end. Where at the final 6, he does decide to cut Judd at that point, which I think is okay enough from a strategic standpoint, as Judd was probably unlucky to take him to final 2, and he obviously wants to maintain his core group. But again, Judd is someone who he could have beaten at the end. At the final 5, he does vote out Cindy, which, again, not the worst decision, but I still think he probably should have considered cutting Danny over Cindy, as Danny seemed like the bigger threat there. But I think the most egregious decision is at the final 4, where he has the ability to vote out Danny at that point, but instead he decides to keep her around and instead vote out Lydia, which to me is pretty questionable, as yes, on one hand, Lydia is also a jury threat, someone who did seem well liked by the jury, but on the other hand, Lydia is also someone who was very unlikely to win final immunity, and I feel like had he voted out Danny there, that Rafe would have had a much smoother path to the end, as he still had a solid final 2 with Stephanie, and I feel like by going to the final 3 with Lydia, that he and Stephanie were all but guaranteed to win the final immunity challenge. But instead, he ends up going to the final 3 with Danny, where he does seem to think that Danny would take him to the end based off their deal, but then he does decide to let Danny back out of the deal, where during the final 3 immunity challenge, he tells Danny that it's okay if she votes him out, which is obviously not ideal. And while Danny may have voted him out anyway, I still think he shouldn't have said that there, but he does end up getting voted out at final 3 after he fails to win final immunity there. And it's in a spot to where even if he had gone to the end against Danny, that Danny beats him. And really, that's just an issue with Rafe in general. I think probably the biggest issue with Rafe's game is his win equity, where it doesn't seem like he was a massive jury threat despite him being this big power player, where I feel like by the final 5, the only person he reasonably beats at the end is Stephanie. Now, to be fair, he did have a final 2 with Stephanie for a lot of the game, and Stephanie was his closest ally, but it's the fact that he allowed Dan to get so deep into the season without realizing that Danny was very likely to beat him by the end of it, that does maybe knock Rafe down a couple pegs, and obviously I do have to knock him for that, but he still was a massive player in the season, where he still dominated the game from beginning to the end, and was never really in much danger of being targeted up until the tail end of his run. But it's still that flaw of him allowing Dan to get towards the end, mixing in his lackluster win equity that leaves him behind here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have yet another player who essentially dominated the game from beginning to end, had a lot of win equity, and someone who I'm not very happy to have this high on this list, but their game justifies it. But number 3, we have the highest ranked new era player to get into, and here we have Carson from Survivor 44. Now, again, I don't like Carson, and there's a lot that you can talk about with him, but strictly talking about his game on Survivor 44, he plays an extremely dominant game. I can't really deny that, where I feel like he is clearly the alpha of the Tika 3 that ends up running the entire game, and is also the one who had the most win equity out of that group. And I do feel like he still played a pretty impressive game throughout, where early on he is in the center of the Tika tribe, where he's the swing vote during the Helen round. Afterwards, he is swapped over to the Ratu tribe, where even though he is the only person to swap over there, he is able to bond extremely well with the Matthews, the Canes, the Laurens even, that does pay dividends for him later on in the game that allows him to remain pretty safe there. After the merge, we do see the Tikas play the middle as the Soka and Ratus battle off each other. And I feel like it's pretty apparent that within the Tika 3, Carson is the one who not only has the most connections with the various sides, but is also the one who is making a lot of the strategic decisions for the Tika 3 that allows them to take control of the game. Where 2-star, you had them working with the Ratus to take out Josh at that first tribal. Afterwards, they allow Matt to be voted out, keeping Jam Jam in the game. But then you had them flipping to the Sokas the following round, where him and Jam Jam do decide to pull their votes onto Franny to make it seem like they're still working with the Ratus there, when in reality they are fully aware about the Brand blindside taking place there. That's pretty good. They vote out Kane immediately afterwards. They then flip the following round to blindside Fran, the final 8. Final 7, they vote out Danny as well. Now, mind you, at the final 7, there was a potential risk of Carson being targeted by Danny and Heidi, though even then they're able to hold the numbers, and also you have Carolyn playing her idol on Carson to where he would have been safe anyway. But regardless, they hold the numbers there. And really, they just steamroll the rest of the endgame, where they do vote out Jamie at the final 6 and Lauren at the final 5. And even coming into final 4, Carson still had a path to the end, where Jan Jam has said afterwards that he wanted an Altika final 3 and had Jan Jam one final immunity, that he probably would have saved Carson in that spot, which I do have to give him some credit for there. And in a spot to where Carson was the biggest stray throw on the board, where had he gotten the Altika final 3, Carson does demolish a jury vote there, which I do have to give him a lot of credit for there. Though unfortunately, it doesn't play out that way, where Heidi does win immunity, puts herself in the fire against Carson, and takes him out at that point. So I still think Carson plays an extremely impressive game, where obviously he is part of this dominant alliance, is able to play the middle for a lot of the post-merge, despite them having a numerical disadvantage, without them being in that much danger of being taken out. And I feel like within that group, Carson was the one who not only had a lot of connections to the other side, but also was the main decision maker for that group. And I do have to give Carson the bulk of the credit for how the Tika 3 were able to navigate through the game. Now, with that said, it's not sole credit, where I still have to give Jan Jam some credit as well for his social game, and even Carolyn at a point, but I do look at Carson as being the most integral to the Tika 3 success, and I feel like Carson would be the highest on a winner ranking had anyone in the Tika 3 gone on to win the season. So I do feel like Carson's place on this list is very well justified. The reason he is not in the top 2, however, is I feel like the top 2 played similar level games to Carson, but also got massively screwed over in how they were taken out in the final juror position, where despite Carson playing as impressive of a game as he was still taken out through a mechanism that he could have anticipated, where he knew that the final 4 final ranking was coming, he knew that Heidi was someone who could take him out, and yet he was unable to stop that from coming. Whereas I feel like the top 2 were people who could not have anticipated the ways in which they were taken out, and through that, I feel like they had more excuses for why they were taken out in the positions that they were. Whereas I feel like Carson could have done more to prevent his fate in the game, but because he didn't, I do have him here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and as I alluded to a moment ago, these top 2 players were people who were essentially screwed over in how their seasons played out, where I feel like had their games played out more naturally, that they very likely would have gone to the end and potentially won their seasons. But due to these very unlucky and very sudden circumstances, they end up being final jurors instead, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 2, I did decide to go with the more recent player of the 2, and here we have Devin from Survivor HHH. And I feel like Devin played an extremely impressive game on his season, where I feel like he definitely had a ton of agency in how the season played out, and still had a path to potentially win the game at the end. Where early on, he is in a very solid spot on the Hustlers tribe, where he builds a very tight connection with Brian, and they are major decision makers to take out Simone and Patrick at those first 2 tribals that they attend. After that, he gets a pretty interesting swap, where he is the only hustler to come over, where the heroes and healers are split 2-2, and that should have made him the swing vote coming into that tribal, where he's seen poised to side with the heroes, but then he gets extremely unlucky, where Joe ends up getting an advantage that allows him to block Devin's vote there, and mixing that in with Joe having an idol, that does result in Devin losing out on that vote, losing Alan there. And honestly, that's not ideal, but not really something I can really fault Devin for. But I feel like Devin recovers pretty well afterwards, where he and Ashley are able to flip Desi to where it does seem like Desi would have been open to flipping against Joe had they ever gone back at the tribal, but they don't. And then we get to the merge where Devin's able to reunite with Ryan, and through the hustlers and heroes working together, that becomes the majority for the next few rounds, where they're able to start picking off the healers in Jessica, Desi, and Cole. But then the final 9, he's pulled into the Roundtable Alliance that's able to blindside JP, and further weakens Ryan and Chrissy to where they're locked into working with Devin more so moving forward. And then we get to the final 8 where he's part of the majority again to take out Joe. And again, from the final 7 on, I feel like Devin is in a very prime spot to get towards the end, where he still has his final 3 with Ryan and Chrissy. Even beyond that, he still has connection with Ashley from their swap tribe. But again, it's around this point that he does start to get very unlucky, where at the final 7, he does be pulled into the plan to target Ben. However, Ben is able to play his idol there, negating all the votes except for his own, where he does take out Lauren there. At the final 6, he is once again part of this plan to target Ben there, but that time Ben finds another idol and even plays it before the votes are cast that forces them to put their vote onto Ashley, which is obviously not ideal for Devin, as Ashley was, again, one of his numbers, though at the same time, he still had his final 3 with Ryan and Chrissy, so not a major knock, but again, pretty unlucky that Ben found another idol immediately after playing one. And then we get to the final 5, where they do target Ben again, and yet Ben finds another idol and plays it successfully once again. And it was also on a spot to where Ben was targeting Devin there. And in most situations, Devin would have been idle out of the game at the final 5. However, he makes an extremely impressive move by throwing a vote onto Mike just in case Ben plays an idol. That does result in a 1-1 tie where Mike does end up going out on the revote there. So again, Devin gets extremely unlucky that his primary target in Ben was able to find and play 3 idols in a row, which is very unprecedented in Survivor history. But on top of that, I do find impressive that Devin was able to effectively save himself from being idled out the final 5 through him throwing that vote onto Mike there. And then we get to the final 4 where there are no more idols to be found or played. Ben loses immunity. And in every other season of the show up until this point, Ben would be voted out here 3-1. Devin gets to the end. But instead, this is the season where they introduce the forced fire-making twist that is obviously now a staple on Survivor, and for better or worse is something that modern players had to account for. But in Devin's case, this is something that he could not have prepared for, as this was a complete surprise to the players coming into the Final 4. And I feel like in Devin's case, he did get screwed over by the inclusion of this format here. And to be clear, it's not necessarily the fact that Devin is screwed over by this last second format change that puts him towards the top of the list, as I feel like had he played a more standard Final Juror game and just happened to get screwed over here, he'd certainly still be higher on the list than what his game would justify, though certainly not in the top 2. But it's the fact that he gets screwed over despite him playing a extremely impressive game, where I feel like he did have a ton of agency within his game and was in the majority for pretty much the entire game. That is what elevates him towards the top of this list, as I do feel like Devin still played an extremely impressive game and is still someone who could have won at the end, as I do feel like had he gone to the end against Ryan and Chrissy, he definitely would have had a shot there. Now, granted, it's not a guarantee that he wins, but I do feel like he at least has a shot of winning against Ryan or Chrissy there. But it's the fact that he does get screwed over through this inclusion of this twist that for the time that he played was a surprise and a twist, mixing in the fact that he plays an extremely dominant game is what puts him here at number 2 for me. And now at number 1, the best final juror in Survivor US to me should be pretty apparent at this point, but that person is Cirie, and this is her game from Survivor Micronesia. And again, I feel like Cirie plays an extremely impressive game on her season, was a major factor in how the season played out, and is someone who ends up being a final juror due to being massively screwed over in the game here. Where early on, she is in a pretty solid spot in the original favorites tribe, where she is effectively the swing vote early on between the Parvati, Amanda, and Ozzy side versus the Penner and Yao-Man side. And obviously, while I don't have to decide right away where Fairplay does quit the game at the first tribal, we later see her decide to side with the Parvati, Amanda, and Ozzy side at the following tribal, where they do end up voting out Yao-Man there. After the swap, her, Amanda, and Ozzy are able to hold on to the numbers there by voting out Joel, Chet, Tracy, and Amy there without too much difficulty. And then we get to the merge, where she does become part of the Black Widow Brigade that essentially dominates the game moving forward, where especially after they blindside Ozzy at the final 9, I feel like Cirie is in a very powerful position at that point, where I do feel like Cirie was definitely the one making a lot of the decisions for the Black Widow Brigade, where I feel like she was the one that was devising a lot of the plans that they would put in place. And Cirie herself was able to remain very well positioned within that group, where she has a final 3 with Parvati and Amanda. That does allow her to get through a lot of the game there. We obviously have the final 5 round, where she does play a role in convincing Eric to give up immunity, which is still a very impressive move. And while I think there's a lot of shared credit to be given with the likes of Amanda, Natalie, and Parvati being involved with that, I still have to give Suri at least some credit for being involved with that plan, coming up with the idea. We get to the final 4 where, again, her final 3 is able to hold true and take out Natalie. And that really should have been it, where at that point, Parvati, Amanda, and Suri were the final 3, and that should have been the end of the game. However, due to James being medevaced at the final 7 that really threw out the production schedule, that caused them to switch to a final 2. And this really screws over Suri, as obviously, with Suri being such a massive threat, and with Parvati and Amanda being more inclined to take each other to the end over Suri, that obviously puts Suri in a very tenuous spot in this final 3, where after she wins to win the final 3 immunity, she gets taken out there. And it's not really a thing that I can really blame Suri for, as she had come into the season expecting it to be a final 3, as the last few seasons had all been final 3s, and final 3s were starting to become the norm in Survivor at this point. And it's really through something completely outside of control, that being James being medevad, that caused the format of the season to change at the last moment. Where I feel like had she known that the season would end in a final 2, that she probably would not have gone to the final 3 with both Parvati and Amanda, who were closer to each other than they were to her. I feel like she would have changed up her endgame had she known that, but because she wasn't able to anticipate that, and it ends up really screwing her over once it gets down to the final 3. And it's also not something that's really normal for Survivor, where at least with the fire making challenge on HHH, that was something that production had planned for ahead of time, and with it now becoming a more standard part of the Survivor format, it's at least something I can excuse a bit more. Whereas I feel like the format change that screws over Suri is something that is not normal and not something that normally happens on Survivor, and it's more so an ad hoc decision that was made due to something that happened outside of her control there. So I do feel like Suri is someone who is more screwed over than Devin was, while still playing a similar level of game to Devin, and was also someone who was never really in much danger either, was part of this extremely dominant alliance, and is also someone who did have some win equity. Now, to be fair, I think it would have been a very tight jury vote had it been a final 3 between Parvati and Amanda. However, I do think Suri definitely had a shot of winning that, but it's the fact that she was still screwed over, despite her playing an extremely impressive game, that does elevate her all the way to the top of the list for me. And it's because of that I do have her here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it helps with the channel. Now, I certainly plan to do more videos like this in the future, so be on the lookout for that. And obviously, as we head towards Survivor 50, be on the lookout for coverage of that season when it comes out, but it'll come out soon enough. I'm on Patreon and have YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.